would protect children by addressing the factors that fuel illegal immigration and fraud at the border. Before we hear from our witnesses about the impact immigration policies may have on children's development, I'd like to set a couple of facts straight. First, school-age children, regardless of their or their parents' immigration status, have access to free education and several federal programs, which include health and nutrition benefits. Second, children coming to the U.S. illegally who are separated from their parents are provided medical care, mental health care, and education services. Other services available to children, regardless of their or their parents' immigration status, are provided through Head Start and Early Head Start programs, which aim to help with children's growth in areas such as language, literacy, and social and emotional development. Most notably, states and school districts are obligated under Plyler v. Doe, as you noted, to provide all children, regardless of their immigration status, access to public education at the elementary and secondary level. Federal elementary and secondary education programs also serve students who are illegal immigrants. This idea that this administration's actions are denying children access to education and child nutrition programs is false. That said, we know that all children, including those U.S.-born with immigrant parents or children who are immigrants themselves, may face trauma. As we learned during a subcommittee on civil rights and human services hearing in September, the statistics are heartbreaking. Studies show that 26% of children in the United States will witness or experience a traumatic event before they turn 4, and more than 2/3 of children reported at least one traumatic event by age 16. These traumatic events can significantly affect the child's education and impair their ability to learn. That is why Congress must address the root causes of the immigration crisis, not its symptoms. Unfortunately, House Democrats are so obsessed with impeaching President Trump and trying to undermine the Trump administration that we've been unable to get to work on bipartisan solutions. And once again, instead of working on bipartisan solutions, the Democrats are using this hearing to cherry-pick stories to advance a partisan narrative. I look forward to the testimony of Mark Metcalf, who's worked on these issues as an attorney and immigration judge. Judge Metcalf is proposing solutions that should have bipartisan support that would address the trauma and fear immigrant children face. Many of these solutions have also been proposed by the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress. I thank our witnesses for being here today and look forward to hearing your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. on December 17th. I'll now briefly introduce our witnesses. Our first witnesses will be Gabriela Bajas Gonzalez, who is an assistant professor at the Center of Early Childhood and Health Development at the Department of Population Health at the New York University School of Medicine. Her research focuses on prevention of mental health problems and the promotion of academic achievement and health in children from immigrant and ethnic minority populations. And at this point, please recognize our colleague, Representative Castro, to briefly introduce his constituent, Mr. Martinez, who is before us today.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to introduce a fellow San Antonian, Pedro Martinez. Mr. Martinez joined San Antonio Independent School District as its superintendent in June 2015. Since then, he has brought a laser-like focus on improving academic achievement for the district. In January 2016, Superintendent Martinez unveiled the SASD Blueprint for Excellence, Target 2020, a 5-year plan with 10 academic goals. The district has since seen a continued upward trajectory with strong gains in academic achievement. By 2019, its accountability ratings from the Texas Education Agency, the district received an overall grade of a B, a wide improvement from just a few years before where they received an F. Throughout his 20 years of experience in education, Superintendent Martinez has received numerous awards and recognitions for his commitment to turning around educational systems that have struggled academically. I want to thank him for being here today and for sharing his experience in the district. One final note, Chairman, the San Antonio Independent School District, where I went to school, where my brother went to school, was part of probably the most significant case in education in the nation's history, known as SAISD versus Rodriguez, which was decided by the Supreme Court in 1973, and unfortunately, where the Supreme Court said that education is not a fundamental right in the United States. But since then, so many big folks have been working and fighting for the students of San Antonio and the students like them across our country. Thank you, Superintendent, for being here.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Representative Guthrie to briefly introduce his constituent, Judge Metcalf.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman Scott, for yielding, and I'm proud to introduce the Honorable Mark Metcalf today. His constituent of mine lives in one of my 21 favorite counties of Kentucky, Garrett County. Mr. Metcalf is the Garrett County Attorney in Lancaster, and he's been there since 1990. He's been the 2013 Kentucky's Outstanding County Attorney of the Year, and he's twice represented Kentucky before the U.S. Supreme Court, and is also a Reserve Lieutenant Colonel and in the Command Judge Advocate General. Really appreciate him being here. I was in Garrett County, which is about 2.5 hours from my home, on Monday, and was going to say hello to him, but they said he's preparing for a hearing. So he should be prepared today, because he was prepared on Monday for sure. I would like to yield to my friend, fellow Kentuckian, Jamie, or Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Representative. And I just want to echo what Representative Guthrie said about Mark Metcalf. He's been a lifelong friend of mine. Appreciate your leadership, your public service, and Mark Metcalf's one of the premier immigration experts in Kentucky, so we're glad to have you here. Mr. Chairman, or Representative Guthrie, I yield back.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Lonray Falusi is a pediatrician at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C., a past president of the D.C. chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and an executive committee member of the AAP Council on Immigration, Child, and Family Health. She has practiced and taught primary care pediatrics for over a decade and serves as a medical director of advocacy education at the Child Health Advocacy Institute at the Children's Hospital. We appreciate all of the witnesses for being here today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we've read your written statements and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D and committee practice, each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. Let me remind the witnesses that pursuant to Title 18 U.S. Code Section 1001, it is illegal to knowingly and willfully falsify any statement, representation, writing, document, or material fact presented to Congress or otherwise conceal or cover up a material fact. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it will turn on and the members can hear you. As you speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow to signal that you have 1 minute remaining. When the light turns red, your 5 minutes have expired, and we'd ask you to wrap up. We will let the entire panel make presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember to once again turn your microphone on. We will now begin with Dr. Brajas Gonzalez.
Good morning, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to this important hearing. This is truly an honor. I commend you all for your focus on this important issue and hope you find my testimony today useful. Approximately 5 million U.S.-born children, that is, about 7% of all children in K-12 schools living in the U.S., have at least one undocumented parent. Immigration policies and their enforcement have the potential to adversely influence millions of students in our nation's schools. I come before you today to share findings from my research with pre-K and K-12 educators, school-based mental health professionals, and parents from several regions across the country. The data I am gathering corroborates the growing literature base documenting the negative impact of immigration enforcement activity and threat of activity on children and school communities. The immigration-related rhetoric that preceded the 2016 elections and subsequent immigration policy changes and enforcement practices have left many children and families with feelings of deep anxiety. I began this research, which consists of interviews with parents, educators, and mental health professionals, after teachers with whom we had been working with for 5 years as part of a longitudinal study of child development started asking for resources to address the fear and angst they were seeing in their classrooms. Children and youth who perceive their parents to be vulnerable to immigration detention, regardless of parents' documentation status, are enduring various degrees of fear and anxiety at home, in their communities, and at school. Because children's perceptions of their own safety is closely linked to the perceived safety of their caregivers, many children with immigrant parents across the nation do not feel safe. Children's anxieties and fears are being fueled by chronic uncertainty about their rights and their own safety, and by a persistent and pervasive fear of losing a parent. Given the negative pre-election immigration-related rhetoric, when the results of the 2016 election were announced, some children believed that their parents would be immediately taken away by police or ICE agents. A 10-year-old asked his parents, "Am I going to have to care for my sisters? When do you have to go? Where are your suitcases?" In July 2019, after threats of national ICE raids, an 8-year-old panicked when she learned that her mother was going to go buy groceries and begged, "Don't go outside, Mommy. I don't need to eat." I share these examples to illustrate that children believe that their parents are in danger of being taken away from them at any moment. Children are not only worried about their parents, but are also fearful for their own safety and that of their siblings. What does this daily fear, uncertainty, and anxiety mean for children's learning and well-being? Children's perceptions of the current immigration climate may impact their learning and well-being in at least 3 ways. 1, an inability to make it to school. For children, extreme worry and fear about their parents being detained may lead them to not want to do things that require them to be separated from their family, like going to school. 2, when they do make it to school, children may not be able to stay in school due to inconsolable distress. 3, an inability to focus when in school. Children are wondering if their parents will be home when they get home and are vigilant for threat in their everyday activities. Teachers, school administrators, and mental health professionals indicate that they are being impacted in at least 3 ways. 1, given the shortage of mental health professionals in schools, teachers and administrators are spending extra time trying to manage children's distress. 2, teachers and mental health professionals are spending extra time connecting to students who are absent. And 3, teachers, administrators, and mental health professionals are also experiencing a range of emotions due to the current immigration climate, including anxiety, guilt, stress, uncertainty, and hopelessness. Additionally, mental health professionals indicate they are being impacted by the climate in 2 additional ways. Their workload has increased, and their work has gotten harder, as the children already in treatment are getting harder to treat. Teachers, administrators, and mental health professionals indicate they want and need more professional development training around trauma-informed approaches to education, training around implicit bias, legal resources to help navigate the current immigration climate, more mental health professionals and support for these professionals in schools. Several counselors I spoke with were the only counselors for 500 students or for 750 students. The recommended ratio is 250 to 1. I hope the information I have shared with you today provides a deeper understanding of the potential breadth and depth of harm caused to students who are vulnerable or perceive themselves to be vulnerable to our national immigration policies. Thank you for the opportunity to share this research with you.
Thank you. Mr. Martinez.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and members of the committee, thank you for providing me the opportunity to speak with you this morning about the issues facing immigrant students and their families in San Antonio and across the country. My name is Pedro Martinez, and I serve as the superintendent of the San Antonio Independent School District, SAISD, in San Antonio, Texas. Our district covers the urban core of San Antonio, serving approximately 49,000 students in over 90 campuses. I am also the board chair of and member of Chiefs for Change, a nonprofit bipartisan network of state and district education leaders committed to increasing student outcomes. The more than 30 chiefs who are part of the network oversee education systems that collectively serve more than 7 million students. My fellow members and I share a core belief that all children should be free to learn, free from fear, and that schools should be safe and welcoming places for all children and their families. It is not only our legal obligation to serve all of the students who come through our doors, but it is our moral obligation. I sit before you today not as a Republican, not as a Democrat, but as an American, an immigrant. the leader of a school system that has been enriched by the presence of immigrant students. I am not here for a political debate. I am here to offer my perspective and the importance of serving all students well, regardless of their immigration status. As someone who was born in Mexico myself, I know the experience of being an immigrant student, an English language learner firsthand. With the support of the Chicago Public Schools, the Catholic Church, and a strong family of 12, I was able to succeed in becoming the first in my family to graduate from high school, from college, from graduate school, and being a naturalized citizen. It fills me with pride that most of my younger siblings followed in the same path. In fact, 3 of them are now teachers in the Chicago Public Schools. Our story shows the greatness of this country. My parents never had a job where they earned more than $7 an hour, and now all of their living children have risen out of poverty and are proud Americans helping improve our nation, including a veteran who served 3 tours in Iraq as a proud Marine. In San Antonio, we also have a history of proud high school graduates moving on to contribute to the workforce, the community, and the country. Nearly 9 out of every 10 students in our district identifies as Hispanic and Latino. Roughly 70% of our students are considered at risk, while 90% qualify as economically disadvantaged. But we continue to see improved performance across all of our subgroups. Graduation rates and college-going rates are on the rise, while dropout rates are falling. The diversity of our students is a source of strength and pride in our district. San Antonio itself is a city rich with immigrants. They are productive and hardworking individuals who become great contributors to the community and our schools. Having led SAISD for the past 4.5 years, I've seen a remarkable turn in conditions for our immigrant students and their families. Conditions in SISD changed dramatically in the spring of 2017 after national elections and the Texas legislature passing Senate Bill 4, which punished sanctuary cities and forced police to start looking at immigration status of our citizens. The combined effects of these events has led to fear in my community. This atmosphere has contributed to student attendance dropping, parents and other family members becoming less likely to attend school events, and some enrollment decline. I've witnessed a growing culture of fear within the community among immigrants, many of them who are afraid to send their children to school because they fear arrest and deportation. These fears have risen in both documented and undocumented residents and undoubtedly impact the health and happiness of our students. Here are some quotes that reflect the fear in San Antonio. Quote number 1, although my children were born here in the US, I'm always nervous about enrolling them in certain school programs that ask for my information. I don't want the school to know that I don't have status here. Quote number 2, I get so worried that every time I drive my children to school, my neighbor recently got deported after the school stopped him and his children on their way to school. For this reason, I don't drive as much or engage in school events. Quote number 3, I have a son in 5th grade who constantly asks me if I'm gonna get deported. It breaks my heart because I can't tell him that it won't happen to me. I have witnessed the strength of the family unit, and that's what it takes for these families to be so successful despite many incredible struggles. The fear of a tear in that family unit or the effort to regain strength because of a tear in that family unit shows up as a great and enduring scar on the body of humanity, a great suffering for lack of compassion. It is evident in our community in San Antonio is dealing with trauma resulting from the uncertainty around the immigration status. In this environment, we have built a strong response by creating a welcome center. We've trained our teachers, our counselors. We partner with our community to ensure that all these children are successful, and I'm seeing evidence of this every single day. As Representative Castro said, last year, our district had the largest achievement gains in the entire state of Texas. We're now the fastest improving district in the state, even as we're dealing with these challenges. But again, we have had to partner with our community, with organizations. We've had to train our teachers and counselors to ensure that our children know their rights and that they're not afraid to come to school every day. Thank you.
Thank you. Judge Metcalf. Is your microphone on?
Thought it was on, sir. I apologize. It's an honor to be here today before this great committee. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ranking Member Mrs. Fox, thank you as well. It is an honor. As a youth, I served in this, the finest deliberative body the world has ever known. I briefed bills and attended hearings for my boss and your colleague, Harold Rogers of Kentucky. I've got a cold. I apologize, sir. I want to talk about immigration today in a way that we can understand it at the ground level. America accepts more people to lawful permanent residence and citizenship than any nation in the world, all of them combined. In 2018, more than 756,000 people became U.S. citizens, and since 2009, 7.2 million naturalized citizens entered the fabric of our nation. Immigration is among our proudest dynamics. It is a crown jewel in our crown. And in 2017, there were 1.2 million persons that received lawful permanent residence. That's unheard of. Only in America do we have this kind of engagement with the world. Only in America. In Kentucky and nationally, no distinction is made between children in our schools who do not have legal status and their native-born counterparts. Likewise, children get fed in school programs, before school, during school, after school, and in the summer school feeding programs. And since I am a prosecutor, I can tell you our state courts operate in the same manner. No false or invidious distinctions are drawn between the native-born and the foreign-born. All are treated on a case-by-case basis according to the facts and the law. I was an immigration judge in Miami. I dealt every day with these issues. I instructed parents from the bench to get their children into school. So they would grow up and have the best concept of this nation. And even,
Judge,
I want to say to you,
Judge, you have a bottle of water in front of you. If you need anything else, just let us know.
thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I even had pushback from some parents who said, Judge, through an interpreter, I want my children not to go to school this summer. I said, I want your children in school, and I need proof of that. And they got them into school. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. But I also want to talk to you about disincentivizing illegal immigration. As a judge, I also saw the dark side of immigration. In Miami, easily one half of my calendar never came to court. In 2005 and 2006, 59% of those ordered to appear in court never showed. Over the last 23 years in our court system, 38% of those people ordered to court never showed. Why does this affect these children? It's because these children are being trafficked. I want to make certain that the committee understands when I walk out today, pardon this cold. I will talk through it, I promise. With the last 14 seconds I have left, I will assure you that the points I drive home today are that with order in our system, we will have laws enforced, Mr. Chairman, that will dignify those children who are brought into the U.S., legal or illegal, so that they are protected and so that they reach the right places at the end of the process. Being placed in a UAC program is the right thing. And if you examine the numbers over the last 3 years, you will see that the Obama administration and the Trump administration were both vigorously placing children in the unaccompanied children programs that are operated by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. I think that's a good thing, and I think it reflects well on the Congress, it reflects well on both the Obama and Trump administrations, and it dignifies this nation the way immigration should be dignified by taking care to listen to all cases and handling them with the blind justice that is required of our country. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Flusig.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today.
Thank you, ma'am.
I am Dr. Lonray Falusi, a pediatrician in DC and executive committee member of the American Academy of Pediatrics, or AAP, Council on Immigrant, Child, and Family Health. I'm testifying here today on behalf of the AAP and its 67,000 members. The AAP is nonpartisan and pro-child. Pediatricians care about the health and well-being of all children, no matter where they or their parents were born. Currently, 1 in 4 children in the United States lives in an immigrant family, and 9 out of 10 children in immigrant families are U.S. citizens. Today's anti-immigrant climate, discriminatory social policies, and heightened immigration enforcement create and perpetuate unprecedented challenges for this growing population of young people, resulting in both short and long-term negative developmental outcomes that are costly for children and for society. I've witnessed this in my own practice. Children with undocumented parents complain of headaches and generalized pain brought on by the extreme stress and fear of knowing that their parents may be deported at any moment. I've seen patients decline to participate in SNAP, WIC, and Medicaid, despite the fact that they are eligible for these programs, but they fear that use of these benefits may harm their or their parents' green card applications under today's proposed public charge rules. I'm especially troubled when I see parents of newborns refusing WIC benefits. Caring for newborns is a privilege for me. They have an entire lifetime ahead of them full of promise and opportunity. We know that their future is brighter when they have access to healthy nutrition to build a brain and body that are healthy. However, over the last 2 years, more and more parents in my practice are declining to apply for WIC, including a 4-day-old boy who I saw recently. He was born in a local hospital and thus is a U.S. citizen and would most likely qualify for WIC, but his parents were hesitant to apply because they were afraid that they might jeopardize their ability to stay in the United States. They knew about the breastfeeding support, formula, and food benefits that WIC offers, but unfortunately, due to anti-immigrant rhetoric around the use of these programs, they've decided to avoid these services. I've also cared for patients who are separated from their families as a result of various federal policies. When children live in fear of being separated from a family member, it can impact their health and development. As children develop, their brains change in response to environments and experiences. Fear and stress, particularly prolonged exposure to stress, that's serious stress in the absence of the buffering relationships of caring adults, also known as toxic stress, can harm the developing brain and harm short and long-term health. When little bodies are in constant fight or flight response, stress hormones remain elevated, continuously activating the nervous system and suppressing the immune system. A critical role of a parent or known caregiver is to buffer this stress, but separation from a parent robs children of this buffer. Separated children can thus face immediate health problems, including physical symptoms like headaches and stomach pain, changes in body functions like eating and sleeping and toileting, behavior problems, difficulty with learning and memory. Children who have been separated may also experience feelings of mistrust, embarrassment, guilt, or shame. In the long term, children who have been separated may be susceptible to chronic conditions such as depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, diabetes, and even heart disease. Despite the challenges that immigrant families and children face, many offer tremendous assets and demonstrate remarkable resilience. Resilience is fostered through strong family relationships and community support. Policies that support immigrant families, such as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA, have demonstrated positive impacts on the development of children in this country. The mental health benefits to children whose mothers are protected by DACA and therefore protected from the fear of deportation are large and clinically significant. Children who did not live in fear that their parent may be detained and deported saw significantly decreased diagnoses of adjustment disorder and anxiety disorder. As a pediatrician, I know that children and families who have faced trauma can begin to heal with trauma-informed approaches and community support. As such, children in immigrant families should have access to nutrition, education, legal representation, and other essential services to support their growth, development, and capacity to reach their full potential. We must continue to support all immigrant children and families in the U.S. and treat them with dignity and respect. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Under Committee Rule 8A, we'll now have questions from the members. Under the 5-minute rule, as chair, I've decided to go at the end, so I yield to the next senior member on the majority side, will be followed by members on the minority side. First, Representative Grijalva.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the hearing. It reaffirmed for this committee and for all of us that Congress has an obligation to all children, regardless, and not only by legal and constitutional precedent, but by the moral imperative that we have in this committee to make sure that all children are cared for and cared for well. One question, and it was brought, Dr. Felicia brought it up, and let me address it to both of you, Dr. Barajas Gonzalez. At least in the districts that I represent, and the one in Tucson, Arizona, a drop in the enrollment for child care subsidies, i.e. CHIP, WIC, and even after-school, preschool kind of programs, a fear that as a consequence, that because of the discussion about public charge and other things, that parents don't enroll their kids as a protection for themselves and their kids. How can the federal government ensure that eligibility criteria is clear, that parents understand that they do not have to reveal their immigration status for their children to receive those services? And I'll begin with you, if I may, Doctor, and also Dr. Felicia.
Thank you for your question. In conversations that I've had with parents about the type of communication that they would find helpful, it seems that right now, any communication, as helpful as it is, does not ensure their feeling of safety, given changes that have been happening to immigration policies. What would be helpful is clear language that states that, for example, it's only the child's immigration status that matters in receiving certain benefits, not the parent's immigration status. I think that has not been made as clear as it could be, and there's confusion around that. So to protect families, families are closing up. Thank you.
Doctor?
Yes, thank you. So I agree that families are scared, they're confused by the proposed rules. I find that families that I speak with are often feeling that they're placed in this impossible situation, whether they access these benefits and ensure that they and their children remain healthy, but then risk possibly being separated in the future, or they forego these vital services so that they can stay together in the United States. What we try to do in our health center is to ensure that families know that, as for now, they can access these benefits, but I find that families are choosing to play it safe and either to decline using the benefits or are calling to disenroll from these benefits. So what we can do, I think, is to ensure that families continue to have access to these benefits as they're eligible for, and to remove the fear and anxiety that has accompanied the use of the benefits recently.
Yeah, Superintendent Martinez, you mentioned DACA and the net benefit, not only in the 20,000 plus DACA recipients that are now become educators and are in our schools working high need areas, but the kind of stability that brought to households and families and the benefit derived of that. Everything's in abeyance right now as we wait for a court decision and other things and the attacks on DACA and the rescinding of it by this administration. But would you comment on what many perceive to be, and your opinion is very important, the net benefit of DACA?
Absolutely. I think DACA, as imperfect as it was done when it was created, probably was one of the best things that ever happened to our students. One of the things that I love is that we work with our DACA students on a regular basis. We, for example, have a Dreamer Summit where we invite parents as well as our undocumented students. We don't ask them necessarily for their documentation status, but we just invite them. And we've been doing it now for 4 years. The numbers grow every single year, and we give children access to information about college and scholarships and giving them access about how to fill out the alternative financial aid form. And we've created a safe environment for them. And so when I see we have teachers that are actually former DACA students or currently DACA students, not only in my district, but across the entire county of Bexar County and San Antonio. And so these are productive citizens that are actually making a difference in their communities and helping us educate our children. And of course, for me, like I said, it's one of the biggest, I would ask of all of you in a bipartisan respect to really fix the issue of DACA and really make these individuals permanent residents.
Thank you very much. You're back.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the members for being here today and testifying. And Mr. Martinez, for the most part, I love your city, except for the time I spent there in basic training in the Army. I will put that disclaimer out there. I know you had said, and you have a very compelling story. I read your testimony last night, and you said you've seen a remarkable turn in conditions, and Dr. Gonzalez said the same, on our immigrant students and families. Conditions in the San Antonio district changed dramatically in the spring of 2017 due to both the election of President Trump and the Texas legislature passing Senate Bill 4, which effectively bans sanctuary cities. The combined effect of these events has led to fear in the community. Atmospheres contributed to student attendance, and you gave that in your testimony. The truth is that President Obama, and following the law, deported almost 3 million people. And ICE deportations in 2009 to 11 were 385,000 per year, and 12, 410,000, and 15 and 16, slightly less than 250,000. President Trump, his administration, deported in 17, 226, 18, about 250, and in 19, FY19, about 282. So the numbers are far less with the Trump administration. So I don't understand either the people are not getting the information correctly, because the data, those are the facts right there of deportation. And Judge, I want to follow with you. I led the Doctors Caucus to the border about 6 months ago. I went there to see exactly for myself. It was my second trip. I spent 4 days there in the last year and a half. And I watched, I was educated. We went down to the border, to a processing center, to a refugee resettlement area. And this is what these folks have to deal with. And the day I came there, 15 people walked up at the Rio Grande River and turned themselves in. One was a family from El Salvador, I think was a family. So when they come in, these officers are, does this child belong to you? Does it belong to this person? Does it belong to anybody? And they've had, many of these children have been recycled, have been through the process many, many times. That is abuse if I've ever seen it in my life. And so when I visited down there, the officials told me that the biggest challenge they faced was the demographics of the individuals. In 2012, 11,000 individuals from family units apprehended, 473,000. In 12, there were 24,000 unaccompanied children. FY19, 76,000 children. I cannot imagine sending my 14-year-old child from El Salvador across Mexico that could be sexually trafficked, killed, or whatever. No wonder they're traumatized. I mean, any human being would be going through that. And in FY12, family units and unaccompanied children made up less than 10% of all apprehended individuals. In 19, it was 65%. Judge, what challenges do these demographic changes present to our border officials? Are they different consideration for border agents when apprehending a family or an unaccompanied child or a single adult?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Here's the issue. When you have families coming from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, coming from very poor areas, think of southern Mexico and Chiapas, think of Huehuetenango and Guatemala. They speak the Mayan overlay. And not just Spanish, but Spanish with the Mayan overlay. The challenge for the border officials is to be able to understand what's happening with language differences so they can fully understand the story. Now, we found through investigation that as many as 600 children have been trafficked in the way you've just described, the recycling process. And at some of the stations set to receive people, as many as 30% of those children did not test positive for the claimed family members. Where that leaves us is, how do we make the distinctions? Let's think about court, domestic court, state court. We separate children by sight and sound from adults to make sure that they are safe, they are well fed, they are educated while they're held in an area pending their cases. The same thing is true here. No one wants to separate a child from a parent. That's the last thing anyone wants, and one is too many. But one child trafficked is also too many. And so where we're left is trying to enforce the law with the most sensitive gauges we've got, and that's asking questions, doing the DNA testing, listening, and then...
Judge, I'm going to interrupt you because my time's about gone, but I do want to say this. As
Yes,
a
sir.
physician,
Sorry.
And as Mr. Martinez, look, our teachers, our nurses, our healthcare people, we're not immigration people. Somebody came to see me, I never asked, I just took care of them. And that's what you're doing in the school system. What we have to do at the border is do a better job of making sure that is secure and making sure that you're not left with this you're having to deal with. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I want to remind the members that the focus is on the effect of the policy, not the policy itself or whose fault it was or which administration, how the children are dealing with whatever policy we have. Other committees can debate the policy. Gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. It was back in the early 1980s when the United States Supreme Court in Plyler versus Doe found that children have a right to attend public schools without regard to their immigration status. And the court found that any resources saved from excluding undocumented children was far outweighed by the harms that they would suffer from denying them an education. And also importantly, regardless of your position, anyone's position on the parents of these children, whether you think they came here to find a better life or whether you think that they're violators of the law, regardless of where you stand on that issue, the court also found that holding young children accountable for the actions of their parents does not comport with the fundamental conceptions of justice. We absolutely need to understand that these are children we're talking about, children and babies that we're talking about. Dr. Falusi, you talked about WIC. I was just in a WIC clinic in Northwest Oregon last week, and I heard about the fear and the confusion that this administration has created because of its policies with a chilling effect on families who are now afraid to seek out critical services that will help to keep pregnant women, babies, and children healthy. And that's really tragic because, as we heard and read in your testimony, this is a really good investment to make sure that kids get a good start in life. And we know that that's not just happening in Oregon. Children across the country are going without food, without health care, putting them at risk. And I want to note that this includes many children who are U.S. citizens, whose parents may not understand that they do not need to reveal their own immigration status for their children to receive support, The superintendent of Hillsborough, Oregon Schools pointed out that even though they have a significant Latino population, they're not all from migrant families. They're all afraid of what's going to happen to their friends and their families. So these fears we're seeing them in our schools and our clinics. Dr. Falusi, how do you counsel families who are trying to get the best support for their children, for their health and development, but are also so fearful about the consequences? And then also, Dr. Falusi, will you also talk about WIC? Because a recent study from the University of California, the PHFE, WIC, and the County of Los Angeles found that for every dollar invested in WIC, it saves approximately $2.48 in medical education and productivity costs. So talk about the economic risks of not making sure these families are getting those services.
All right, thank you. In terms of how we counsel families, we do try to encourage them to be aware of what benefits they may be eligible for. I think in the current environment, it is difficult for families to decide how to make that choice. I'm fortunate that I work in a health center that is co-located with a WIC clinic, so I can partner with them in educating families about their benefits, and from the pregnant mom whose child I may be seeing now all the way through the child who is about to enter kindergarten. So that is a benefit. I think thinking about co-locating, working more closely within the health sector and our WIC clinics is critical. And then in terms of the economic outcomes, so absolutely, we know that early investment in child health and nutrition reaps benefits for that child, the family, and society in general. And not doing so increases the risk of things like food insecurity, which we know is correlated with poor, decreased math and reading scores. Imagine taking an algebra test while your stomach is growling, trying to focus in school when you didn't have breakfast that morning, or if your family is encountering food insecurity.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to get another question in for Dr.
Yes,
Barajas
yes.
Gonzalez. Doctor, in Northwest Oregon, I've heard stories about the trauma young people from immigrant families are experiencing. And I mentioned the Superintendent Scott from Hillsboro, Oregon, mentioned that a lot of their families are concerned, that the kids are afraid. What are the long-term effects of the trauma that these young people are experiencing? What supports will they need? The superintendent mentioned that some of them feel like, why even try? If how can they dream if they feel so afraid? And to what extent are school districts and healthcare providers and community-based organizations able to provide the support these students need?
Thank you for the question. The mental health educators, mental health counselors and educators I've spoken with have all indicated a concern and their own reach, trying to educate themselves a bit more about what they can do. They're all pointing to a need for more trauma-informed care for children. The long-term impact for some, but not all children, will be potentially under education, under employment, potentially psychological distress. As you said, many people who find themselves unable to dream about a better future because they are living in uncertainty.
Thank you, and I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Appreciate your testimony and your backgrounds. Judge Metcalf, as you have pointed out in your testimony, our legal immigration policies are extremely generous and welcoming. I had the opportunity to see that and corroborate that fact going down the Rio Grande Valley sector just a month ago and seeing the care that was given. I would contend that care and welcoming care that was given to immigrants coming across, legal or illegal, are second to none, certainly surpass anything in our bordering countries. They would not give the same type of care that we give. Are there ways, though, that we could improve the efficiency of the legal immigration system, and again, the legal immigration system of our country?
Yes, sir. There absolutely is. And this Congress is capable of doing that in a bipartisan manner, sir. And I'll give you the 1, 2, 3 on that. First of all, enforce the laws. Grant relief wherever relief can be granted if you're in a court system, and then welcome those people who win and remove those people who do not. And the third thing we do is we enforce the laws that are intended to weave these new Americans into the fabric of our country. So what are we doing already? We're already offering education regardless of immigration status. We're feeding them regardless of immigration status. To refugees, we offer something that looks very much like temporary assistance to needy families. Continue that process. We welcome 80% of the world's refugees each year. The idea that we are hostile to immigration in general or in particular is absolutely false. We have created an entire court system meant to dignify everyone who is brought into proceedings. But to finish the answer, sir, you hit on the thing that I think is the most important thing. How do we improve it? We improve it by doing the things better that we're doing already. We don't need to create new programs. We need to do what we're doing right now very well. The issue for a prosecutor is that it costs more to incarcerate than to educate.
Yeah. And I think you would certainly concur that a nation that makes it very clear that we're a nation of laws
Yes, sir.
and justice, so that anyone determined to come here understands that they will be treated exactly the same as everyone else.
That's exactly
And
right.
the care would be given. It would encourage, I think, more legal immigration and really ferret out more on the wrong side of the law for what they're doing. Let me go on. Considering the statistics you cited and have been discussed today, recycled child, of course, I've heard terrible stories about the recycled child, the actual credit card that they become for cartels to sell to others, to come across the line, then ship back to sell again. That's terrible to hear about that, the unaccompanied children. And the legitimate concern we have that some unaccompanied children are trafficked victims. Would it be responsible to allow children and adults to be processed together without taking the necessary steps to ensure they are in fact a family union?
Well, what you can do, sir, is do that DNA testing on the front end. When you do,
But we can't mandate that yet, can we?
not yet. That's in an experimental stage right now.
And at least what I saw down in McCollum, Texas, was that it was having some significant positive impact.
It's a deterrent, among other things. The anecdotal information is that when a smuggler or someone who's party to smuggling a child for this purpose is asked to give a sample, a swab inside their cheek, they back away.
Back away.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we've seen that. Judge Metcalf, some have argued that we should be more lenient in our detention policies with immigrants who cross the border illegally, claiming that very few who are released pending their court date fail to appear. You claimed, however, that 38% of aliens free pending their trial failed to show up over a 23-year period. Can you explain the discrepancy?
Sure. The higher numbers are subsets of the people who actually showed up for court. Over a period of 23 years, 38% of all those who were placed into proceedings failed to show. Those are numbers that are produced by the Justice Department. And in the last 2 years, they have put out a statement regarding myths and facts about immigration court proceedings, specifically failures to appear. In 2017, they very candidly stated 44% of those ordered to court failed to appear. The high number that you're being given is a true number, but it's a subset of those who are already appearing for court. Okay. In other words, 62% did show, and out of that number, they cherry-picked a much better subset of those who showed up actually 82% of the time.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my question, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit to the record this report by CLASP entitled "Stop Separating Families, Our Child's Fear, Immigration Policies' Effects on Young Children." I want to, first of all, thank unanimous consent? Thank you. I thank you, Chairman Scott, for this very important hearing. As a former teacher, public school teacher for 23 years, actually it's more like 24 years, I know very well what it's like to comfort a child that is in constant fear of deportation. I taught in San Bernardino County, California, and some of my students came from mixed status families, and many of them were concerned and fearful that their parents would be deported. They expressed this fear in their essays that they wrote, and sadly, students today are worrying about similar things, but much worse. And it's happening much earlier in their lives. In 2018, CLASP did a report that outlined how the current immigration policies are impacting our nation's youngest children. And Mr. Chairman, I already asked you to submit for the unanimous consent to put that report into the record. The report mentions that a 5-year-old, quote, whose anxiety was so severe that he was biting his fingertips to the point that they were bleeding, end quote. This fear is starting very early and is seen with children as young as 3. The report also notes that, quote, this pervasive fear is not limited to children in mixed status families, but extends to children whose parents have lawful immigration status, some even who are children of U.S. citizens, end quote. My first question is to Superintendent Martinez. Superintendent, how can teachers and administrators support this unique demographic of preschool-aged minority students that are in fear?
So what we're doing in our district is we've actually even set up meditation rooms. So when we see children that are starting to act out, we immediately involve a counselor. We give teachers strategies. It is, right now, trauma-informed strategies are our biggest demand we're getting across the district, and the children are getting younger. They're starting at 3, 4, and 5.
Superintendent, how are administrators, school administrators and superintendents supporting their teachers that are in classrooms where there are mixed status students?
So we always, one of the things we're very intentional about is ensuring that all of our counselors, first of all, have been trained and so that they know the rights of immigrant students. We partner with MALDEF, we partner with community organizations. We even do parent workshops. We've also trained teachers. And so that has helped us just to be able to at least have the conversations properly. Like I said, right now what our teachers are mostly struggling with is as they see children acting out or feeling stressed or exposed to trauma. For example, every week we had a case this week. We have cases where parents are being deported. And so we find out right away the children have to move with a neighbor, they have to find another relative to live with, and so we're having to organize our counselors and working with our teachers to work with these children.
I see. Well, you know, in summer of 2018, thank you for your response. In 2018, during a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee hearing, Secretary DeVos confirmed that educators cannot call ICE to report undocumented students. However, there have been documented cases of a rise in hostile school climates and numerous incidents of educators attempting to enforce immigration law by reporting students and families to ICE. Unfortunately, the Department of Education has failed to issue guidance emphasizing federal law on this issue since 2015. Superintendent Martinez, what could the Department of Education do to ensure that schools and educators have the tools to support immigrant students and that all staff comply with federal law, and that Supreme Court precedents related to students' access to education and privacy are respected?
So it could be as simple as just having a publication that really clearly delineates student rights. Our board has actually passed policies. They've actually made statements in the public about what our positions are, but having even those written guidelines so that it's very consistent, because the one thing we know about teachers, they care about children. And I think as long as they understand what the rights of children are and that they don't have to feel the pressure of turning a child in as if the child has done something so terrible that they have to be turned into ICE.
Well, thank you for that. So I agree with you. Students should not have to worry about whether their parents will be home when they get back from school. They should not also have to worry that they will have enough food to eat or if they will get any food at school. Their biggest worry should be about passing their tests and getting good grades, and unfortunately, the fear-mongering and policies of this administration and the neglect of this Secretary of Education have made it very difficult for children to only worry about their grades and be children. I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2016, the Pew Research Center estimated that 3.9 million, or 7.3% of the kindergarten through 12th grade students in the United States were either here illegally or were the children of at least one parent illegally present in the United States. Can anyone on this panel tell me how much we as a nation spend on public education for that population of students? All right? It's around $60 billion. A significant and increasing percentage of this cost represents remedial English education required by the federal government for students designated as limited English proficiency, or LEP. In 2016, it was estimated that 9.6% of all students and 17% of kindergarten students were now designated LEP. Educating those students is expensive. By some estimations, we're spending $59 billion just on ESL and other programs to help children with English language deficiency. Can anyone on this panel tell me what percentage of teachers in the United States are certified or trained in ESL? All right, it's about 1%. How about what percentage of ESL programs are paid for by the federal government that requires them? Does anybody know that answer? It's just over 1%. Who pays for the rest? State and local school systems. So we require it, and we push 99% of the cost on state and local school systems. Look, that costs a lot of money for these state and local school systems. Many of them, like my state of Alabama, just don't have it, but because the federal government requires it, they have to put that money in there to the detriment of other programs. At least 13 states spend over $1 billion per year on limited English proficiency programs in public schools. Earlier this year, this committee found that there is a $46 billion public school infrastructure shortfall. Accounting for inflation, teacher salaries are down 1.6% since 2000. Classroom sizes are growing. Resources for students are shrinking. It's amazing we're here to talk about how the Trump administration's immigration policies are harming children. But we never talk about how illegal immigration is harming our students, teachers, and our communities. People who are here legally are being harmed by this. The federal government has mandated that we provide public education to the children of illegal immigrants, but we don't pay for it. States and local districts pay for it. How is that fair? How is that right that we make the requirement here at the federal government and we put up 1% of the cost? Look, I'm a former state school board member in Alabama. I sat across from teachers and superintendents and talked to them about this issue. Dollars that our schools have that are not unlimited. The states don't print money like we do here in Washington. They have requirements that they balance their budgets. And coming up with the money to fund these K-12 education programs around the country is extremely difficult. So I think if we're going to sit here and criticize the president for enforcing the law, we need also to think about the cost of not enforcing the law. That cost is not being borne by those of us in Washington. It's being borne by men and women in the states and local school systems around the United States of America. But really the cost is being borne by children who are being denied the programs that they should have. Children who are citizens of the United States, whose parents are citizens of the United States, they're being denied programs because we're forcing their state and local school systems to take on an expense that we should be taking on because we failed to enforce our own laws. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. And the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also for the ranking member for convening the hearing today, and thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony. I want to first say that I'm very concerned about this issue as a retired educator, as a grandmother, and mother as well. And I'm proud that in Mecklenburg County, our sheriff, McFadden, terminated the county's 287G agreement because he knew that it didn't help improve public safety, nor did it help make our nation's immigrant community safer. And in other words, they're more afraid now than they've ever been. And it leaves immigrant children terrorized in these communities. So as a result, we are trying to figure out really what to do, and the fact that these situations have had chilling effects on the welfare of our children. In fact, researchers at Stanford found that the establishment of partnerships between ICE and local law enforcement have been followed by steep decreases in the enrollment of Latino elementary school students. One study shows that where communities where local law enforcement established these agreements with ICE saw Latino enrollment in elementary schools decrease by 10% over 2 years. And the authors of this research suggest that Latino families living in these communities are fleeing to other jurisdictions where they feel less persecuted. I want to ask Superintendent Martinez how your educators are in San Antonio are dealing with the hostile school climates. Are educators well equipped to address the challenges that they're facing? And if not, how can we best support our educators in addressing these issues?
So it's a constant struggle. I mean, what we're very fortunate about is that our teachers are very passionate about our children. And so they, on their own, we provide trainings after school. We provide trainings on Saturdays. Like I said, we've trained every single one of our counselors. We've partnered with experts because we're not the experts in immigration. And we always remind our teachers we're not required to be the experts, but you need to know enough. Because at the end, the relationship between a child and a teacher, it is so valuable. I don't care if the child is 3 years old or 18 years old. Our teachers have the children at least 7 to 8 hours a day. And those relationships are key. So for us, we're just doing the best we can to support our teachers. We don't get any direct resources, ma'am, from the state or the federal government to do this. We do it on our own because of our board and our community.
Thank you very much. Dr. Barraras Gonzalez, can you speak to the effect that the feeling of fear has on students, including their academic development and well-being?
Children who are living in fear have a difficulty focusing in schools. Children who are old enough self-report that they are having difficulty focusing because they are worried about whether or not their parents will be home when they get home. Children are also more vigilant about things that they perceive to be a threat to them. I heard an example from a school administrator about a K through 8 class out at recess time, and a helicopter flew overhead, and many children ran into the classroom crying, thinking that the helicopter was coming to take them away. So when children are vigilant and scared by everyday things like a helicopter in the air or a police car going slowly, and they perceive that to be somebody who's coming to take them away, it's very hard for them to then focus in schools on the curriculum before them.
So what kinds of things would you suggest or that you've seen that we're doing to really address some of these issues with these kids?
So the administrator in that school partnered with the counselor, and they basically are trying to create stable routines for the children. They have created strong relationships with the parents so that the children feel safe, that when a teacher says, "You're okay here, nobody's coming to get you," the child actually believes that that's true and can then lower their fear a bit to be able to focus in school.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for what you're doing. You know, I've had a number of situations in my district in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, where students were actually met at the bus stop and taken away. We had one young man, for example, who was 2 months away from graduating from high school, never had an opportunity to finish, was sent to Georgia, and ultimately sent back home. So this is a serious issue, and thank you all very much for your testimony.
Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of you for being here today and enlightening this body on how serious this problem is, and it is a very serious problem. In fact, I really, truly am ashamed of all of my colleagues here in Congress because there has been no bipartisan effort to fix this, and that's shameful. That's what the people sent us here to do, and I'm hearing about all of these incredible problems you've got. In fact, I've had the privilege through my church back home to be involved in mission work throughout the world, South America, Africa, and Eastern Europe. And the one thing I witnessed that was common for every area and the folks we tried to help was they had no health care, no jobs, no hope, homes without floors, and corrupt governments. And that was the common thread. It was a hopeless situation. But what I found was these people had a faith that I had never seen. And they were so amazingly appreciative of what we did for them, that we would take our time and go and help them. Yet we have people coming to this country illegally that feel like they're living in the shadows and they're afraid. That's sinful. That should not happen when the people in their very own country who we're ministering to are so happy and glad that we came and helped them. Judge, I was interested in one part of your testimony about trafficking. As I understand it, it is a major problem, and I'll tell you, one of my church members did ask me, a constituent, said, what is the deal with these people advertising? He'd just gotten back from a mission trip. I mean, he said, he talked to one of the people down there about it, and he said that there were billboards advertising, come to America, plentiful jobs, $15 an hour, free health care, free education, and dial this number. I mean, this stuff is beyond belief. And these people are actually, these traffickers are taking advantage of these families promising something they can't deliver.
That's right, sir.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, sir. Trafficking in human beings is a multi-billion-dollar business
Yeah, I just looked it up. It's $100 billion.
worldwide.
Yes, sir.
The Chinese triads, sometimes called the snakeheads, the cartels who operate south of the border. You're never going to get the kingpins. What you are going to get are the coyotes. Some people call them the coyotes. But they're going to usher these people to a border that they control on the Mexican side. And they are going to get these people across at any cost. As you know, they put them in the back of trucks and lock them in. They're not trafficking in human beings now, they're trafficking in human suffering. And the problem that we have in interdicting these is that they're very clever. They can get through the border, or in the alternative, what they do is they set these people loose at the Rio Grande. And what happened last year? A father tries to cross with his son, and they both drown. At some point, you have them caught between a border that's been hardened and hardened criminals.
And that's horrible.
Yes, sir.
Again, as far as the people, okay, so somebody comes in the country illegally. If they touch our soil, they have rights. And so they have to appear before a judge, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then that judge gives them a court date to reappear.
Actually, they're given their court dates by DHS. Their cases are put into the system. They advise where they're going to be, and they give that address, and then they're told, this is the address of the courthouse.
Okay. So, and then there's a large percentage who don't show up for court that disappear into our society.
Yes, sir.
And are living in the shadows, creating this terrible problem for their children, and because they've broken the law.
Yes, sir.
I mean, is that a fact? They broke the law
Yes,
of
sir.
the land?
That is.
And then we've got law enforcement trying to deal with this problem, and their hands are being tied. I mean, there's cities that will not allow our law enforcement to get the job done.
That's obstruction. That's
Yes,
what
sir.
that is.
Well, I can tell you this, and I'll finish up with this. Every member of this body ought to be ashamed that this country is in this situation, and the American people should demand of this body to fix this so that we are a land of laws, law-abiding citizens, and we don't put any family, anybody who comes into this country through what we put them through.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
It's a pleasure, sir.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like, Dr. Barajas Gonzalez, in your testimony, you wrote that for some children, the chronic uncertainty regarding safety and fear born from a perceived hostile immigration climate is a form of psychological violence. Children who attend school while experiencing this much psychological stress often need extra support from their teachers in school. I assume you would agree with me on that. Educational leaders whom I spoke with yesterday from my home in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania have told me that they are seeing a significant increase of trauma-related needs among their students. And I have deep concern that our nation's educators are on the front lines of helping children who are being harmed physically and emotionally by immigration enforcement to the extent that they are no longer teaching in their classrooms, but rather acting in a field for which they don't really have any additional training nor compensation, and it's not what they went into teaching for to begin with. So I'd like to know from you, what are some of the ways that schools across the country are stepping up to support the increased health, educational, and emotional needs of their students as a result of this immigration stress they are experiencing?
Thank you for the question. So the mental health counselors and the teachers that I've spoken with that feel best equipped to be able to handle the distress of children really count on the support of principals and administrators so that there are no fears about whether or not they can address the needs of the children, say in Spanish. So teachers feel comfortable speaking to the child in Spanish at school to calm the child down. The principal encourages this, and that's encouraged by the administrator, so that they don't need to translate anything through somebody else.
So that would be a best practice.
For that child who needs to hear something in their native language, yes. In general, educators and mental health counselors are acknowledging that there's a need for more mental health counselors in schools. The counselors that I've spoken with are usually working with the student body either of 500, 750, or more, and the recommended ratio is 250 to 1. The mental health counselors that I've spoken with have also indicated that children are getting harder to treat. So if a child is being treated for, say, anxiety, and the counselor would recommend that the child play outside or go to church as a form of socializing, they're noticing that children don't want to go outside anymore. They don't want to be in open places where there might be a raid. They don't want to go to church because they're scared that something could happen on the way to the church. Children are imagining that there is the possible fear anywhere that is not their home or potentially their school. So it makes it harder to treat the children. Children are also not disclosing as much to their mental health counselors because they live in fear that something they say, whatever it is that they say, could put their family in harm. So children are withdrawing, even those in treatment are withdrawing. It's making harder for children to be treated because they perceive threat.
Let me stop you there for a moment, although I think we could talk about this for a lot longer. But the corollary of that, I assume, is the additional stress on teachers, on educators and principals and administrators. Is that true?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the psychological impact that this climate surrounding their students is having on these educators and the school staff?
Educators are reporting anxiety and distress, mostly around not being able to calm the children down by being able to say, your family is safe, nothing is going to be able to happen. Because they themselves are not necessarily sure that that's true, it makes it harder for them to be able to say it to children. They feel guilty about that. They are also feeling anxious themselves, with not necessarily knowing the best way to help children right now, given what's happening. There's also, given the increased workload for mental health counselors, some have mentioned the potential of burnout. They say, I could see in a couple of years really burning out because this is a lot to take on, given everything else that we are also seeing in schools.
And I assume collectively that this has an impact also on the other students, the non-immigrant children who are in the classroom, subjected to these external forces.
Everyone is connected in the school system. So if one person, there are studies that indicate that if teachers are suffering depressive symptoms, that the classroom quality does go down. So everyone, yes, is impacted by what's happening.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Banks?
Madam Chair, this hearing is literally labeled how the Trump administration is harming children. But it's the majority party who implemented policies that incentivize illegal border crossings that put children in harm's way. When President Obama illegally issued DACA by executive fiat, he caused the death and suffering of an untold number of children who were coached to cross treacherous desert territory for an untenable promise. In 2014, a little over a year after DACA was issued, there was a 77% increase of unaccompanied children arriving at the border. At the time, our system was built to house 8,000 beds for children. But in just 1 year, we had 70,000 arrive. The Obama administration had to get creative and decided to crowd the children in detention facilities. Photographs taken in 2014, now infamous, capture what happened. We saw kids in cages. And despite what the mainstream media and some of my colleagues may have told you, the kids in cages in that photo happened under President Obama's watch. While my friends in the majority are interested in gaining new voters, my colleagues and I in the minority are trying to sort out this mess and keep children safe. So we know how this began, and that gives us a clue on how it should end. We need to stop giving false promises to migrants, and the only way to come to the United States is the right way, to come legally. Judge, how have the attempts to disincentivize illegal immigration differed between the Obama and the Trump administrations?
The difference between the two has been that President Obama's efforts to, as you put it, place children in cages was a result of high number of people surging. I don't think anyone wanted to put children in cages, and they were actually behind chain link fences. They quickly moved them to the UAC program as quickly as they possibly could, about 53,000 at the worst part of the surge. The Trump administration did even better, 73,000. What happens when you disincentivize is you use DNA. That's one thing. You create the presence of safe camps so that the cases of the needy individuals, the authentic asylee or refugee, can be determined, and those people admitted, and the others not. That's how you harden the borders right now, and you do it in the softest way possible so that you do not create more of what's being described as trauma for children. But I will point out, the people that came on these journeys put themselves at risk to begin with. And I don't blame them for trying to have a better life. No one here does. But when you engage in that kind of a journey, we already know that people are going to be assaulted, women are going to suffer sexual assault, and kids will be taken away from parents and held for ransom. We know that. But when we get to the border, if we create the safe camps or the safe zones for them, hear their cases, get them in, do the DNA, we will accomplish a great deal of what we should have been accomplishing years ago.
Apparently, while counterintuitive to some, what you're saying is that enforcing our laws and cracking down on illegal immigration is the compassionate way to end the crisis and the suffering on our southern border. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Washington, Dr. Schreier.
Oh, there's that microphone again. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses today. Together, you paint a frightening, grim, and frankly heartbreaking picture of the effects of this administration's immigration policies on the well-being, both present well-being and future well-being of our children. One day, these children are going to grow up to be adults, and history suggests that given opportunity and education and support, they will become tomorrow's medical researchers, entrepreneurs, teachers, and military service members like your family. They are America's future, and if we fail them, we will hurt our own country in every imaginable way. As a pediatrician, it has been my life's work and passion to support parents and children so those children grow up healthy and strong and live up to their potential. And as you know, Dr. Falusi, we spend a lot of time discussing things like nutrition and sleep and safety and emotion coaching and nurturing relationships and activities that will stimulate young minds. Well, the policies of this administration undermine every single guiding principle that we teach, and I'd like to touch on a couple of topics. Dr. Falusi, you spoke about immigrant families declining WIC benefits, and also SNAP benefits and CHIP, Children's Health Insurance Plan benefits, for fear of being labeled a public charge. And this means that children who are eligible for these safety net programs are not getting adequate nutrition, health care, developmental screenings, and immunizations. And it means parents are not getting the guidance that they need. I wonder if you could comment on why this is detrimental for children, for families, and also for our society writ large.
Thank you for the question. So absolutely, I see families who are eligible for all of these programs, but due to public charge concerns or other rhetoric are choosing to decline the services or to disenroll. What this means for the children is that they could go without the adequate nutrition that they need to build healthy brains, that they need to then focus in school to become healthy, productive adults. There's a clear link between early childhood nutrition and healthcare and education with long-term health effects. Kids who do not have adequate healthcare, nutrition, and education become adults who are less healthy, less productive, And that means less economically secure for them and their families, which then, of course, translates into less economic security for our society.
Thank you. You also spoke about the plight of children in government custody at the border. I have also visited. 7 children have died while in government custody. Many, if not most, are experiencing toxic stress, especially those separated from not just parents, but family members. As pediatricians, we are well aware of the devastating lifelong consequences of toxic stress on children's brains and bodies. I'm working on legislation with Senator Murray to specifically address the needs of children in custody. And it goes without saying that children would be best off not in detention facilities at all. However, given our current circumstances, I wonder whether you might be able to share your thoughts about whether there are tools and techniques that could be implemented by CBP agents to help children and families emerge from these circumstances without lifelong damage.
So I would agree, and the American Academy of Pediatrics has been clear on this as well, that children should not be detained, and that they should spend at least the least amount of time as possible in the processing centers. However, if they are to be detained, then this is where it's really critical to have pediatric expertise at the border. So we've talked and heard about trafficking and those other concerns. We've talked about, as you mentioned, children who have unfortunately died in custody. I think some of these things are part of my training, right? I'm taught to look for red flags for trafficking. I'm taught to look for those subtle signs of what's sick in a child. Children are not just small adults. They're very subtle signs that they exhibit when they become sick, and then become very sick very quickly. But having physicians, nurses, mental health professionals with pediatric training at the border, I think will help to mitigate some of these issues.
Thank you. I have one last quick question for Superintendent Martinez. Here's some of the things I've heard from teachers in my district. This is a quote. "Sometimes I don't get to say goodbye. I have to hope that they are okay and that someone can get them a message from me. When we do get a chance to say goodbye, usually it's both of us crying and them just wanting to know what they did wrong to deserve this, and I don't have an answer for them." A different teacher says, "I tell students that if they work hard enough, they can achieve anything. Study hard, work hard, and you'll write your own future. But sometimes it feels like I need an asterisk to say, unless you're a DACA recipient." Can you talk about ways that schools can support immigrant children?
Yeah, and unfortunately, those stories are very prevalent with my teachers. And so what we have done, and we continue to emphasize this with our students, whether it's our welcoming center, where we have all of our students, whether they're coming from Mexico, from El Salvador, or from Afghanistan, they all walk through it. We work with our children that have aspirations about college, and that even if they're a Dreamer student or a DACA student, that there's opportunities for them. Sometimes I feel, I feel a little bit, I worry because, again, I'm not an immigration expert. My teachers are not immigration experts. We partner with people that are, and what they will tell us is that they have, and they've been doing this work for many decades, they've never seen this type of rhetoric. They've never seen this type of vagueness. And so if there's one thing that could be done on a bipartisan, it's just to clarify and really reduce the rhetoric, because our children are listening to these words. And so I think that's the most important thing. And so that's what our teachers are trying to console them. But again, these are children, and words are powerful to them.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Metcalf, you mentioned human trafficking in your opening remarks, and I think a lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle downplay the role that lackluster border security has with respect to human trafficking. In your experience as an immigration judge, can you give us some real-life examples of the impact human trafficking has on people's lives, especially with respect to little to no border security in parts of America?
Sure can, and thank you for the question. First of all, let's talk about the effect on children. Human trafficking has the effect on them that has been described by these great pediatricians and education professionals. It has that kind of an effect. Secondly, what does it do? It incentivizes and re-incentivizes the growth of this $100 billion business, so that, and we need to keep this in mind, committee members, that when you traffic a child and you find that that child has been trafficked, they become a person who then receives relief under our laws. So we are already giving that child the benefit of any doubt, realizing that they were trafficked, and we welcome them into our American family because of the way they've been treated. Now, how do you stop it? You stop it only with the ways that have commonly been used at the border, and that's to harden the border and to infiltrate those groups as much as you can. But the best techniques they've found so far are rather soft. You create safe zones, safe camps, DNA testing. Listen to whether you hear the sound of authenticity in the stories, because the traffickers also do this. They create stories for the trafficked people to tell. We heard it all the time in Miami. We even saw some of these traffic stories being retold with different people. So the idea that you get rid of trafficking by hard measures is not always true. Law enforcement can do it using our Mexican partners to help us. But the other thing we do is we use smart enforcement. What they're doing at the border right now is minimizing its impact on children, maximizing its effect on its deterrent effect.
You mentioned DNA testing, and I believe in your testimony you've mentioned a pilot program that found 30% of cases where DNA testing showed no matches among individuals seeking asylum as family members. Why are adults bringing these children that are not related to them across the border and claiming they're children?
So they can get in themselves.
Right.
That's the whole idea. Children have become the all-purpose means to enter the United States and stay. And smugglers know it, and they are maximizing the use of small children for that purpose.
The last question I wanted to mention is something near and dear to me, which pertains to child nutrition. I think that's a bipartisan issue. I think we all support child nutrition. The U.S. Department of Agriculture today just released some new requirements with SNAP that have already been criticized by many of my colleagues to the left. One of the programs that's under the subcommittee that I lead in this committee is the Child Nutrition Program. And my question to you is, are you aware of any regulation, guidance, or directive by USDA Secretary Perdue or anyone else in the Trump administration that would limit in any way access to school meal programs for children of immigrant families?
There are none.
Absolutely.
My
And
wife feeds 4,500 kids a day.
right.
Never is anyone asked, what's your immigration status?
And that's something that gets misstated many times by critics of the Trump administration with respect to child nutrition programs. So I appreciate you clarifying that. I appreciate your leadership on this issue in Kentucky and look forward to working with you in the future. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me first say I'm a teacher, and educators sign up to teach all children. To Mr. Martinez, you referenced the power of words. I would like to just say to my colleagues, the use of the term illegal versus undocumented is unsettling. No child or human being is illegal. As leaders, we should refrain from using such language when referencing the status of an individual, especially a child. I remember one day in my classroom very clearly. I came in and half of my students were absent, and I'm thinking, what's going on? And one of the students came up to me and said, Ms. Hayes, you didn't hear what happened? And I said, no, what happened? And she told me about a raid at a local grocer where 2 people had been arrested. But as a result of those 2 people being arrested at this grocer, 14 kids in my class who were unrelated to them didn't come to school. And it got me thinking, because I had no idea that I had that many students in my class who were undocumented. The other thing that stood out, and it didn't matter to me what their immigration status was because they showed up and I taught them. The other thing that stood out for me is that all the other kids in the class did know. So I imagine a scenario where these kids were counseling each other, and carrying that burden as children of making sure that their classmates felt safe, and then not knowing what to do in response when that safety was gone. There's so many things going on right now, but my question is for Mr. Martinez. You know, we've heard of multiple reports of immigration officers operating near schools and detaining parents on their way to school, dropping off their kids. Can you describe how these interior enforcement activities, like these, as well as larger activities like I just described, strain teachers and schools?
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that happens in any classroom is the classroom becomes a family. So when you see a disruption to the family for whatever reason, it affects the entire classroom. Every week we're seeing incidents that are happening, and it seems like it's accelerating, especially this school year. And so for us, what we're doing the best we can is just ensuring that, again, our parents know their rights. Because one of the things that we find over and over again is parents are very, they're very believing, and so they'll believe that, oh, it's okay, just sign this and you'll be okay. And then next thing you know, the child's been separated. And so for us, we're partnering with these community organizations who are the experts, but even they're telling us how vague things are today. And so that's our biggest challenge, Representative, is just helping provide good information to our teachers and our families.
I know you published an article about parent engagement. Do you find that it's more difficult for parents to be willing to engage in light of things that you just said?
Yes, ma'am. So we have to work 10 times harder to have the trust of parents. And the good news is that we've been doing this now for almost more than 3 years, that we're gaining trust. But again, every time an incident happens, I mean, it's another rebuilding of trust we have to do. And so that is just something for us that is part of our parent engagement strategy. It's part of our counselors' work. It's part of our specialists that work with parents.
Thank you. Yesterday, the Government Accountability Office released a report regarding IDEA dispute resolution activity. Mr. Chair, I'd like to submit this report for the record.
Without objection.
The GAO reported that immigrants' parents may choose not to bring a dispute forward for fear that the school district may retaliate against the family and jeopardize the safety of the family. Do you find that children are not receiving special education services as a result of this?
We fear that that is the case, and we see it definitely when we see learning challenges in the classroom or behavioral challenges. And so what we have informed our therapists is that to work with the parents, again, continue to make sure that they know their rights, that getting a diagnostic on their child is not something that's going to be counted against them in some way. And so again, that's a continued effort that we have.
Thank you. And I guess I'd like to close by saying we've heard a lot about traffickers and children being coached across the border for nefarious intent. I cannot let this moment pass without mentioning my friend Yvonne Orozco, who was brought here at age 12 and is what we call a dreamer. And in 2018, she was named the New Mexico Teacher of the Year, and she teaches Spanish and ESL education to kids in her community who are also undocumented and entered this country. And she is one of the highest performing teachers in that state and has had a very successful career. So I urge my colleagues to consider the cost of not educating 7% of our population. And it doesn't matter if these were Obama-era regulations or Trump-era regulations. We own them now, and it is our responsibility to fix it in the now. With that, Mr. Chair, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Let's see. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, thank all of you for being here today, and Mr. Martinez, I want to congratulate you for the good work you're doing in San Antonio. I live in Arlington, which is a little farther north. I think you probably know Dr. Cavazos, my superintendent, who I think is one of the best anywhere, one of the best superintendents. It's a smaller district, over 60,000 students, but we have a lot of the same issues up there in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. 36% of students are from immigrant families. And East Arlington, Grand Prairie, it rises to 50%. So we're dealing with a lot of the same issues, and my hat's off to all school administrators, all the teachers that are dealing with these issues. I want to start by stipulating that, because you've heard a lot of political talk here today, everybody on this committee cares about children. We don't want children harmed. We don't want them to live in fear. Any suggestion that anyone up here or any political party has a monopoly on caring for children is just ludicrous and insulting. Another stipulation I want to make is we're a nation, and you've already heard this, we're a sovereign nation, a nation of laws. There's absolutely nothing wrong, nothing racist, nothing mean or uncaring about expecting people from foreign countries to respect the laws of the United States of America. There's nothing wrong with that. And when someone comes to our border from another country and they don't have papers, they don't have a visa, they're undocumented. But the moment they cross that border, they're illegal. They're not just undocumented. And there's nothing wrong at all with speaking honestly about these issues. And we need to be honest about it because we're never going to solve it otherwise. If you come into this country and you violate the laws of this country when you come in, you're here illegally. Now let's talk about why children live in fear of their parents being deported. It's not because of the American people. It's not because of the United States of America or its policies. And it's not because of Donald Trump. It's because adults have led or have brought children into this country illegally. Well, of course they're going to worry about deportation. Of course they will. But let's stop this nonsense, this political talk that frankly is quite cheap, that, well, it's Donald Trump's fault that children live in fear. That's just stupid. They live in fear because of choices that their parents or some other adult has made that brought them into this country. That's why they live in fear, and it's long past time that we keep these adults, make them responsible for the choices they've made. It's not the fault of the people of America. It's the fault of the adults that have made those decisions to come here illegally. Judge Metcalf, you talked about illegal trafficking. Or you also, and in your experience, did you encounter the issue of children being used to help transport drugs across the border?
Those cases were being prosecuted by the United States Attorney's offices, sir. What we did encounter was the fallout from those, where children were involved collaterally. And if they were part of a scheme in which trafficking was involved, those children were brought into the country, our country, and given safe haven.
I can tell you that in the briefings I've gotten from Border Control and Department of Public Safety in Texas, it's a huge problem in the Rio Grande. They will use children.
Yes, sir, they do.
To cross that river, and the children are sitting on the drugs, on rafts.
They are. We learned these things through what happened in Miami. Children were being trafficked there as well. People would get off cruise ships, claim that these children were family members. What would happen? DNA testing, swabbing, in other words, revealed they were not.
Great. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this important hearing. Mr. Chairman, I'm concerned that since his election, Donald Trump has signed several immigration executive orders that have implemented extreme immigration policies and stoked fear among immigrants and non-immigrants. I'm especially concerned as someone who has had community members in my district, this is Michigan, far from the southern border, ripped away from their families, detained and deported, all to satisfy this administration's disturbing views on immigration. I remember grieving with the young nieces and nephews of Jimmy al-Daoud, a Chaldean Iraqi man from my district, who was detained by ICE and deported to his death in Iraq, to his predictable death. Jimmy came to America when he was a 1-year-old, and he lived most of his adult life struggling with myriad mental and physical health conditions. While he was ethnically Iraqi, he had never actually set foot in Iraq, where our government deported him. He was born in a refugee camp in Greece. He died when he was deported to Iraq because he did not know the language, he did not know the people, he had not been provided even the basic legal documents necessary to live and move about in Iraq, and he did not have access to the medical care he needed to survive. He was a diabetic, and he didn't last 60 days. I cannot imagine what the next day at school must have been like for his nieces and nephews, knowing that their loving uncle had just been deported, or later, that he had died as a result. So in Jimmy's memory and thinking about his nieces and nephews who I met at his funeral, I would like to explore the impact of this president's extreme immigration policies on our classrooms and kids, like Jimmy's nieces and nephews, and on their teachers. Dr. Falusi, can you speak to the long-term psychological impacts of an experience like that, more broadly of living in constant fear of family separation, and how those impacts affect a child's development and academic performance over time?
Thank you for the question. So certainly living in constant fear and anxiety can stimulate the toxic stress response that I described, which we know has both short and long-term effects. And maybe one of the best ways I can share this is by talking about a child who I saw just yesterday in clinic, a 14-year-old girl whose mother has temporary protected status, TPS, but with the uncertainty about TPS, the mother's from Honduras. Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of anxiety in the family. Speaking with the girl herself, my patient, she actually has started seeing a therapist to help her work through this anxiety. I told them that I was coming here today, and I asked them what they would want you all as decision makers, as legislators, to hear. And her mom said, what I want them to know is that just to think about the trauma and the suffering of the children. Think about the suffering of the children. And she actually used the word disintegration. You know, is the disintegration of my family worth it? Is it worth it? My children have never been to Honduras, she said. Would I pull them out of school and have them go to a country that they've never been in, and they lose their mother? If I was deported and they stayed, I'm the one who picks their clothes, who takes them to the doctor. Just kind of describing really what the impact would be on her children, on the family, with this uncertainty and the life that they're living.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Barajas Gonzalez, you know, we are federal policymakers trying to think about the whole country broadly. What can you tell us about the broad implications of this administration's actions, like the one I described and countless others among all our constituents, on immigrant families and their children? You know, if you sort of wrap up about what you think the implications are and what we should do.
So I wrote a social policy report that was published by the Society for Research on Child Development last year, using a community violence framework to understand the impact of immigration enforcement threat on children. And so what you're describing speaks to sort of the long-term impact that we see of violence. Depending on your proximity to the violent incident, the duration of the incident, and how greatly you were impacted by it, you will see a manifestation in children that is equivalent to what you see with children that are exposed to violence. You're going to see lifelong trauma. You're probably going to see mental distress, potentially anxiety and depression later on. And you may also see underemployment and undereducation of children.
Wow. All right, my time's expired, but thank you so much for your testimony and all of your work.
Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses for taking the time to testify before our committee today. However, I will not be asking questions today because the issue of our immigration crisis, while it is extremely important, does not fall within the jurisdiction of this committee. The main committee that has jurisdiction isn't even meeting in their own committee room today. So where are they? Well, they were in the Ways and Means room attempting to build a sham case to impeach our president. Our immigration, yes, is in dire need of reform. However, holding hearings such as this one highlights the obvious disdain for this administration from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but does nothing to advance solutions that will actually address the challenges faced at our southern border. This is not a Republican or Democrat thing. With my ministry background, I have led groups as many as 10 different refugee camps, or worked in 10 different refugee camps throughout Europe. This is a compassionate thing. But what we should be focusing on is a 2,900% increase in the numbers of families that dangerously are crossing the border this past year. 60 different countries. We should be focusing on 2,200 pounds of fentanyl seized at the border over the past year, including 15 million pounds of drugs seized since 2012. We should be focused on the alarming number of criminal organizations trafficking children across the border. You want to talk about anxiety for children? I can't think much worse than that situation. We should be focused on the 14,000 convicted criminals that crossed the border. We should be focused on 4,300 migrants in distress that have been rescued at the border. If we are truly committed to addressing the immigration crisis, then we should be working together on the committees of jurisdiction rather than celebrating Festivus today, airing our grievances with no solution in sight. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Trone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Fox for holding this important hearing today, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. We all agree all children deserve a safe and healthy childhood. However, this administration has continuously worked to implement policies that discourage or prevent children and families from accessing education, health care, and other services that they're eligible under the law. One area we've seen the negative consequences in the Trump administration's immigration policies and rhetoric is in early childhood space. In interviews with focus groups with early childhood education providers, the Center for Law and Social Policy has learned that many children had previously attended early care education programs are leaving these programs. Many providers are reporting significant drops in enrollment in attendance. But a child's eligibility for these federal public programs is predicated only on the child's immigration status, not the parents. But the families are foregoing enrolling for fear of putting family members at risk. Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Falusi, given what we know about how the brain develops so much in the first 5 years of life, what are some of the potential consequences of this decline in early care and education enrollment, and what can be done to further prevent these declines?
Children who attend early ed centers and programs such as pre-K start kindergarten ready to learn. So what you see with children no longer attending those programs is you're going to see children starting off behind their other children and having to catch up. Because learning is cumulative, children are having to forego the learning they would have had in those centers because of family fear. So you're going to see lower academic achievement in the short term in children trying to catch up. Dr. Falusi.
And I would add that there is a direct link between education and health. We know that when kids are educated from an early age, there is a return on investment on their health in the short term and in the long term. So these issues are very much linked, and for that reason that we advocate for, again, following the laws that every child, right, should have access to quality education.
So these policies are driving income inequality, driving health inequality, and certainly fueling our criminal justice system, where we're spending $80 billion when we should be spending that on education. Supreme Court decision 82 in Pyler v. Doe was pretty clear about children's rights. But in recent years, states like Alabama have attempted to force schools to collect information about legal status of students. More recently, elementary school leaders in Tennessee refused to provide information to ICE when the agency requested students' records for fear they'd compromise the security of their students and families. Mr. Martinez, To the best of your knowledge, do teachers and leaders in the schools know the rights of their students? And can you tell us what some of the legal deterrents are in place to prevent ICE activity in these schools?
So the great thing is that we remind our teachers and our principals and our counselors, these are federal laws. Privacy, for example, is protected for all of our children. We've actually even, because of Senate Bill 4, we even made our own policy for our school police because we work very hard to make sure the school police weren't subject to that law at the state. So we also work with our community organizations and parents for them to know that our police department doesn't have the ability to even ask them for their documentation. And so for us, it's been a constant training for teachers and for staff overall. I've been very fortunate that our staff have embraced it. Of course, it's still very difficult to make sure that we have the trust of the parents, and that is the uphill battle for us.
Do you think the school leaders are prepared and comfortable to respond to these ICE requests throughout your area, like were made in Tennessee?
They are, because the guidance we give them is you call our police department, and our police department have become experts in this, and that's been one of the unintended benefits of Senate Bill 4 is we've become experts on what we're required to do and what we're not required to do.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Obviously, a country has immigration laws for many different reasons. I've been down on the border myself 3 times this year. In addition to the reasons you have the laws, one of the things that struck me is how horrific it can be for the people trying to come here. People dehydrating to death in the Arizona desert, women being assaulted by the horrible gangs that right now control the border, because the United States does not control the border. It hadn't occurred to me that it's horrible sometimes for the kids who come here too, even when they get across the border. Apparently it's very psychologically risky to them, and it's unfortunate that parents would ever want to put their children in that situation. I'm going to each ask the 4 of you what you are doing in your private lives to make sure we don't have so many illegal immigrants coming here, subjecting their children to this uncertainty and possible psychological problems. Are you weighing in politically? Are you writing letters to your congressman? Are you educating the other congressmen here how bad it is when we let people in this country illegally, how the children are the ones paying the price? I'd like to go down each of the 4 of you, start with the one on my left, your right, as to what you're doing to try to discourage these illegal immigrants from coming in this country.
The one on the right, Dr. Barajas Gonzalez.
Right.
Yep.
You're first.
I am a developmental psychologist, so I have been speaking with teachers, mental health professionals, educators.
I mean, to prevent people from coming in the country in the first place, are you advising the parents to go back home, or what are you doing to in your own sphere of influence to discourage people breaking the law and coming in the country?
90% of the Latino children in the United States are U.S.-born children, and they are experiencing an extreme level of fear and concern given the political rhetoric.
Well, I don't know anybody who's arguing against illegal immigration, so I don't think that's a problem. What we're talking about today is you say there is fear among children because their parents have come to this country illegally and that someday they might be deported, which is understandable. Obviously, the easiest way to solve the problem is not have people come here in the first place. So I'm going to ask each one of you if you are concerned about the children or don't want to have more children in this country illegally or children of parents who are here illegally. What are you doing in your own sphere? You're all leaders in your own community. I'm sure congressmen or senators would be listening to your concerns. What suggestions do we have, or what are you doing to prevent people from coming in this country illegally and presenting us with this problem? Or you don't care if people come here illegally. You don't care if the children are being stressed, which seems to me part of what happens when we have people break the law and come in this country. Just as people, quite frankly, would probably be a little bit concerned you know, whenever their parents are putting themselves at risk for doing whatever, you know, have any of you done anything, you know, written your congressman, written letters to the editor, you know, said this is what happens to children when parents decide to come here illegally instead of legally? Do any of the four of you have any suggestions or have done anything to help this problem from getting worse?
So Representative, with all due respect, what I tell my students and children is that this is a nation of immigrants. That's how our nation evolved. That's why it's the best nation in the world.
Are you doing, well, I know every year in this country we swear in 700,000 new immigrants legally. I think we have about 4 million people in this country on work visas legally. But the purpose of the hearing, as I understand it, is their concern among children whose parents have broken the law to come here that they might be deported. Well, obviously, the one way to deal with that problem is not having people come here illegally. And I'm wondering what you're doing, since you purport to see damages, psychological damages to children whose parents are coming here illegally, what you are doing to prevent in the future more children being in this predicament. And the obvious way is to say, you know, in the future, come to this country legally. But what are you doing to, doing along those lines? Or
Given the national anti-immigrant rhetoric, children are conflating their ethnicity with immigration status. So children who are here legally
that's not
and
answering
are
the question. Is
here
any
with
one of the
parents
four of
who
you?
are here
No, we only
legally
give me
are
5
feeling
minutes here.
fear because they are conflating
None of you
their
have done
ethnicity
anything?
with immigration status.
None of you have done anything to discourage illegal immigration or to encourage your congressman to?
Congressman, I appreciate the question. As a prosecutor, I handle each case on a case-by-case basis. We do have people that are here illegally. They are treated exactly the same as their citizen counterparts and are given the
I'm
same
disappointed
sentence.
that nobody has done, none of the four of you have cared enough about this problem to contact your congressman or encourage somehow to prevent illegal immigration in this country. I'm just very disappointed that you didn't care enough.
So I think I can best answer that question as a pediatrician by saying that the children that I see experience extreme trauma in their home countries, and that's why their parents have decided to leave. Children don't just choose to migrate, they're fleeing, and families who then come to the border seeking asylum are doing so because it is their right to seek asylum.
Thank you for, that's why I always tell people back home, I say I have a great relationship with my committee chair, Bobby Scott. Thank you for giving me an extra minute.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony and for being here today. We're living in an era where, unfortunately, this president and his administration have a white nationalist running immigration policy. And they have tried to inflict the deepest harm with a viciousness that we've not seen, at least in a few generations. And that bigotry obviously has extended beyond the executive branch and into the legislative branch. And I want to thank you for testifying to the harm that many of these students are experiencing. Immigrant children, the children of immigrants, and as was just mentioned, even folks who are not in either of those categories, but are simply grouped in by the larger American society because of their ethnicity. That's what we saw in El Paso when a madman drove 10 hours from Dallas to El Paso to murder 22 people, most of those being American citizens, many of them, most of them of Hispanic or Latino descent. They were not immigrants at all. They were Americans. So thank you, Doctor, for pointing that out, that it becomes an issue of ethnicity as well. Right now, students lead dual lives in a way that none of us experienced when we were in middle school or high school. That is, they have a social life both in person and then a social life online. And one of the biggest problems that we have in schools, not only on this issue, but just generally, is bullying. And my question to you is, because this creates their status or the status of their parents may create a situation where they can be bullied either by teachers or administrators or fellow students. And that bullying, quite honestly, can be across racial and ethnic lines, or even, as I saw when I grew up on the west side of San Antonio, intra-ethnic bullying, where people were calling each other wetback and call each other mojados. Mr. Martinez, what do you see in SAISD today?
Yeah, I mean, we have about 500 children that have been released from detention centers that are now in our district. And so one of the things that we are being very intentional about is where these children are placed. We do notice as the children get older, especially children from Central America, they'll sometimes clash with our students that are born in Texas or even from a Mexican descent. And so we've become just much more conscious about it. And the good news is that we have enough schools that we can find the right placement. But we're even, for example, going to develop a newcomer center at Irving Middle School, which is a dynamic dual language academy now. And so for us, we're making sure we're trying to get ahead of it, especially because we know the numbers will probably continue to rise in our district.
To the doctors, either of you, if you have something to, some perspective to add on that?
There has been an increase in aggression, such as bullying noted, with some children echoing what they hear in national discourse. So children may not be aware of what they are repeating, but it is being repeated in schools and causing distress to other children.
And I think what this calls for is increasing our capacity for mental health services for these children, making sure that clinicians, mental health professionals are trained in trauma-informed care, thinking about the totality of experiences that the children have had either in immigrating here or as children of immigrants or experiencing the bullying in schools.
And Mr. Martinez, I want to ask you also, can you give some context about, in your school district, who these people are? Thank you for bringing my friend Patty Radel, the chairwoman of the board, with you, a longtime advocate on the west side of San Antonio. Good to see you, Patty. There's a lot of misinformation about who these people fundamentally are. I think it's odd that every Sunday, pastors across this country ask their parishioners to go down to Latin America in a way that will be helpful to the people there, in a way that will help save the souls of their parishioners. Why is it that the people are good enough to be helped in Latin America, but they're not good enough sometimes to be treated as human beings here in the United States? Who are these people?
Our experience, Congressman, is these are all individuals that want to follow our laws. In fact, they've always received the statement that, hey, as long as you're not a criminal, as long as you follow, those type of laws, you're going to be fine. These are individuals that are active in their churches. They want to be active in their schools. They tend to be some of my best students. And by the way, there is no one group. So some are undocumented adults where the children are born here. Some are the children are born in a different country. They come from different places. I have a group of children from Afghanistan that we have at one of our schools, and they're the wonderful families that just want to understand the system in the U.S. Somebody said this earlier. They're the most appreciative individuals that I've ever met. Everything we do, from our services, providing them uniforms or food or giving them access to just resources in the community, they're the most appreciative individuals I've ever met in my life.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I apologize. I've been in another hearing that I was ranking member, so I couldn't come to this. So it's important to be here. And so I didn't hear a lot of the context. But I want to just briefly, as Mr. Metcalf knows, I'm from Bowling Green, Kentucky, a refugee area. And my family personally is helping several families that are on TPS status from El Salvador. They came in 2001. They're legally in Bowling Green, Kentucky. They're on legal status, but it keeps getting updated every year and a half or 3 years, depending. So they always have to hit a deadline, and it really brings a lot of uncomfort to their family and trauma because their kids are U.S. citizens. Their kids speak. I've talked to a parent where their kid's translating, and the parent will say "sí," and that's, I know a limited Spanish, but I don't know what that means. And the kid, you hear the parent say "sí," and the kid looks at me and says "yep." And so that means, or they learn how to speak, they speak with a Kentucky accent. I mean, it's just, they are honor students in high schools that are there. But they live in this fear that, how are you going to send the parents home when their kids are U.S. citizens and we move back and forth? And I just want to remind, because I worked on it, about this time last year, about a month from last year, the president offered to sign TPS
and he offered to sign DACA if he could come up with a deal on our funding, and we just couldn't get there. And so the president has said that he would sign DACA and he would sign TPS. I was going to put that in there for the record. That was an offer that he made, because I know the TPS because I was involved in it. So still, they did get an extension, but they're still extending. We're trying to help them get permanent status, but that's where we are. And hopefully we can come together bipartisan to solve this problem, because it is a real problem, and kids do face it when their parents, I mean, these are legal parents who may lose their legal status. And then the kids are, I mean, they don't know El Salvador. They were born and raised in Bowling Green, Kentucky. They're as Bowling Green, Kentuckian as I am. So we just need to be mindful of that when there may be an opportunity to do something coming up very, very soon on this. So hopefully people will be mindful of that. But the biggest issue, Mr. Metcalf, again, it's great to have you here. It's great to be in your hometown the other day. As an immigration judge, this is the big thing. We get all the children at the border, they get an ORR, which I was in a meeting earlier that has oversight of Office of Refugee Resettlement. And then there's this big lag between getting their adjudication, which they have the right if they come here as a claiming asylum to be adjudicated. But it seems to be this big lag, and how you handle the children between coming here and making their asylum claim and going through the judicial system. So what's a typical caseload and the backlog, and what would be your suggestions of dealing with it?
First of all, my caseload in Miami was 1,400 cases. I inherited from a judge who had retired. I cleared my 1,400 cases almost within a year. All I did was hear cases. I opened court at 8, and I didn't close court until the last case had been heard.
Can you get a hear? Does that give you enough time to, I guess going in, you prepare before you go in. I know how you operate, but.
Right. I prepared every case, and I stayed late. I didn't seek a law clerk because the law clerk knows the law, but the judge doesn't learn it unless he's doing it. To give you an example of what needs to happen is we need more judges. With more judges, you can adjudicate more cases. When I finished in Miami, when I started in Miami, we had roughly 150,000 cases in backlog. When I finished in Miami, we had 186,000 cases in backlog, and as we sit here today, we have over 1 million cases in backlog. And the way to deal with that is like we deal with anything else, methodically, professionally, and of course, compassionately. Everyone who came into my courtroom was treated like a person from my hometown. I spoke to everyone in a manner that dignified their presence in my courtroom. I would not allow any court officer to speak down to anyone. Everyone was addressed as sir or ma'am in the language of their choice or usage. Everyone was treated in the way I would want it to be treated if I was sitting on the other side of the bench. And I think that's true of most of our judges. A handful misbehaved, and we deal with that, just like we do with any other problem, by professional correction. But the idea that we can work down these caseloads, Congressman, by having more courts, more judges, methodical enforcement of the law, I think is the best way to go about this. There are no magic wands that can be waved over this problem. It is a human problem, and it becomes, as a human problem, it's a very complex problem. But the only way to deal with it is to deal with it affirmatively and see these problems as opportunities to demonstrate due process to those who are seeking relief in our courts, and show that the rule of law is being followed regardless of who they are.
Thank you, and I'm out of time. And you're all right. It needs to be compassion. When you see look these children in the eye, it's a real, it touches your heartstrings, and Congress shouldn't just look down at the other end of the Pennsylvania Avenue and complain about what's going on. Congress needs to address this problem as well. So I call on my colleagues, let's all work together to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a public health nurse, I'm deeply concerned about the health effects of this administration's policies on children, families, and the communities they live in. And the people I represent in Northern Illinois share these concerns. Dr. Falusi, you write in your testimony that the administration's proposed changes in its public charge rule are having, quote, a chilling effect, preventing legal immigrants and mixed status families from accessing health care that they are legally eligible for. As a pediatrician, can you tell us about the potential consequences if these children don't receive care such as well-child visits, particularly for very young children?
Thank you for the question. Right, so the chilling effect that we're seeing is an effect in the reduced use of these benefits, despite the fact that the families are eligible for them. The consequences of not utilizing those benefits are children would be less likely to see me, to have the well-child visits. In a well-child visit, we screen for developmental concerns, mental health, we test for anemia, we test for lead, we ask them about their school status, their nutrition status, we inform families about how to care for their children. Having 2 children myself, I know that it's not easy being a new parent, and I see a new child at least 8 times in their first year, if not more. So imagining those families not seeing their pediatrician and going without that guidance, that care, those screenings, and medical treatment where needed is really concerning.
Now, the proposed public charge rule hasn't gone into effect, but it's been halted by the federal courts. Dr. Falusi, how would those consequences you just detailed be exacerbated if the new rule does go into effect?
So what we worry about is families continuing to call us to unenroll from programs that they're eligible for. So this is beyond even the families who would be directly impacted by the public charge rule, but going into the much broader immigrant community, including those who are, as you've said, legal documented immigrants, those who may actually even be naturalized citizens, but because the law is so nuanced, they may not recognize whether or not they actually are directly impacted. So I worry about families who are not sort of covered under this public charge rule, choosing not to utilize the benefits, and those who may be actually then not utilizing other benefits such as WIC that are not even included within the public charge proposed rule. But since it is a federal government benefit, families are hesitant to utilize them.
Yeah, I'm really concerned about the public health impact of communities all across this country. I want to focus on one of the basic medical services that children get at these visits, which are immunizations. Vaccine hesitancy and misinformation are at dangerous levels in America. Policies that risk lowering vaccination rates risk the health of children, of seniors, of pregnant women, cancer patients, and other vulnerable populations. But this administration's actions risk actively undermining public health and efforts to ensure that children get the vaccinations that they need. Dr. Falusi, what are the specific public health consequences if children and immigrant families delay or do not receive immunizations?
Right, it's just as with any child, going without vaccines leaves them susceptible to illnesses such as the flu. We're entering flu season now. Very much concerned, right, about kids who may be unvaccinated against the flu coming in with coughs and colds and fevers that may last a week or 2 or ending up in our hospitals or in our ICUs. I also recognize that I have trainees who've never even seen some of these illnesses that we've been vaccinating against for 10 or 20 years, and worrying now that we may have more children who are unvaccinated and coming in with these illnesses that we have stopped sort of thinking about because we've been fortunate enough to have significantly reduced the frequency of these illnesses. And we also know that children then go to school, and I worry about children who are unvaccinated being around other children, as we all know children share germs very readily, and being that it's, again, winter time, germs can spread easily within indoors. So I think it's incumbent upon us to ensure that children have full access to the health care that they're eligible for and that they deserve, including these public health measures such as vaccines.
And obviously, vaccinations are critical to reducing preventable death, right? And so if we have a whole cohort of children around the country who are not getting these critical vaccinations, which could save their lives, we have a real problem on our hands. As you know, as you noted in your testimony, 1 in 4 children in America lives in an immigrant family. These consequences will be felt in all of our communities. The administration has also needlessly separated children from their families, violating the fundamental values of my community in Northern Illinois, and failing to make our country safer. I've seen this firsthand on my oversight visits to the southern border. The negative effects of family separation on children's physical and mental health are indisputable. And last month, a federal judge ruled that the U.S. government must provide mental health services and screening to children to address the trauma of family separation. Dr. Falusi, I'm going to send you some questions for the record about that family separation policy and the toxic stress and long-term impacts of those early childhood experiences. But thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your expertise with our committee. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to discuss how children are adversely affected by harmful immigration policy, and thank you to all our witnesses, both for the work that you do and for your willingness to be here to share your expertise with us on this important topic. Just 2 months ago, we held a subcommittee hearing to discuss the adverse impact that traumatic experiences can have on the emotional growth and success of children. In my district in Rochester, New York, nearly 1 in 3 children have a traumatic experience that will hinder their emotional, social, and academic success if not properly addressed. And I was pleased that the takeaway from the September hearing was a consensus by our witnesses that trauma-informed practices in education are critical to ensuring a fair shot at academic success for those children. And I'm proud the committee's work to do better by our nation's youth, including immigrant children. This past July, I had an opportunity to visit with some of my colleagues southern border, both in Texas and in Mexico, and saw firsthand the difficult conditions immigrants and asylum seekers are facing simply for daring to seek a better life for themselves and for their families. I always think parenthetically that I suppose I should be grateful my great-grandparents sailed into New York Harbor at the beginning of the 20th century instead of arriving at the wall in 2019. And it's hard to imagine that America was more progressive in the early 1900s than it is in the 21st century, but I'll leave that to another committee to discuss immigration policy. But the adversities facing immigrant children, starting with conditions at the border and extending to everyday discrimination and fear of deportation, it's clear that children are experiencing various forms of trauma that will impact them for years to come, and we're seeing the effects trickle down to the education and the other resources available to them. A report by the Center of Law and Social Policy describes decreased attendance in child care and educational programs by immigrant children in recent years, resulting in reduced exposure to critical brain development, emotional management skills, and academic success. And as a result, schools are now more than ever in need of support to help students of all backgrounds cope with increased anxiety and fear. And I wanted to ask a question of Superintendent Martinez. In October 2019, the Trump administration reported that today, at that time, which is just a couple months ago, a total of 5,400 children plus had been separated from families at the border. And can you just share what schools are doing to assure that those children who have experienced family separation are receiving the proper services to address the traumatic effects, the mental, psychological effects that come from these adverse experiences?
So we're getting demand for mental health services more than ever, and this is something that's happening nationally, not only in San Antonio. And so we're actually developing now, we call them care units. These are specialists that are staff that are actually therapists, so that teachers don't feel that they have to take that burden on. And so we're creating small teams now within our district. And this is something that I'm seeing in other districts across the country as well, sir. And it is, unfortunately, again, these are not extra resources that we're getting. And so this is something that, again, we're trying to find resources both internally and from philanthropy to even to support us.
So I'm curious if I can just follow up to, how able are you to, as children, I'm sure, are pretty transient in these circumstances and move from district to district, are neighboring districts or districts throughout the state able to track them as they move from district to district? Is the federal government playing a meaningful role in trying to help monitor that movement?
So our biggest challenge is some of these children end up in foster care. And so, and unfortunately, our foster care system was already in trouble, at least in Texas, and it was even in Illinois where I grew up. And so their child services is also overwhelmed. And so what we're doing right now is just having the conversations and saying, okay, tell us what services do you have? How do we leverage our own resources? We offer to, again, you know, with our therapists and counselors, we don't have many. And so for us, that's what we're finding. And these are children that are severely traumatic. I mean, some of them are very, very upset, very angry. They get violent. And so the good news in our district that I've seen is the compassion from our teachers, because they know, they see what these children have gone through. And so the challenge is not every district has that ability. And so some of my colleagues in the smaller districts have even bigger struggles than I do.
So, and I have just a few seconds remaining, but I'm curious, are you doing more in-service education with teachers and folks who are in touch with the students to share with them best practices around trauma-informed care?
Yes, sir. It's actually become our #1 request from teachers, which is great. So it's not, we're not even mandating them. It's their #1 request from us, and that is now starting to drive all of our professional development.
Terrific. Thank you, all of you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank the panel of people here to testify today for being here. I think there's one thing we can all agree upon, and that is that our entire immigration system is broken. While the humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border made headlines for months just less than a year ago, nothing has gotten done on comprehensive immigration reform since the majority in this chamber has lost their focus. While I've dealt with the topic we are discussing today in the House Oversight and Reform Committee, multiple times this issue of immigration reform generally belongs in the Judiciary Committee. So we've dealt with it many times. It belongs to the Judiciary Committee. What's the House Judiciary Committee doing today? Holding another impeachment hearing. No wonder nothing is getting done addressing this and other serious issues facing our immigration system. In this committee, instead of focusing on things within our jurisdiction, we must focus on picking up the slack for the Judiciary Committee. While the topic of today's hearing is concerning the harmful effects of our broken immigration system, this committee has jurisdiction over a number of other areas that need to be addressed. Children are harmed when they are burdened by student debt and failed education policies. Children are harmed when this committee does not do our job properly reevaluating nutrition needs through the child nutrition reauthorization process. Children are harmed when they need prescription drugs and their families cannot afford them. Those are all things that can be addressed in a bipartisan manner in this committee, but not doing so is another opportunity cost of impeachment. Again, I believe most of us agree that immigration reform is needed, but that is not within the scope of this committee. Mr. Metcalf, I just wanted to follow up on something in your testimony that I read and saw, and I want to make sure that I'm clear on this. Children in America's public schools are afforded the same opportunities for access, services, and education as students with legal status. I mean, all the students are accessible to all the same benefits.
That's correct.
Okay, so really the children of people that may not have legal status in the United States are still getting all those things are available to all the children.
Still going to school, still eating, still receiving all of the benefits that their native-born counterparts receive.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that is clear because I think that is so important because that really does explain where the jurisdiction of this lies. The distractions of the Judiciary Committee and the lack of the majority of this House to address these issues, which for a period of time they denied, has really had a cost to our nation's children. And the other thing I would also say is a lost opportunity by Congress, since they're focused on other things, is children of our active duty military and our veterans are harmed when Congress doesn't pass the National Defense Authorization Act so that our people protecting our nation and our way of life have the resources they need to be safe. And I wonder what happens to those kids when they're worried about whether or not their mother or their father is going to have what they need to protect us here at home. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson.
Chairman, thank you. Thanks to members of the panel for being here. Hopefully, we've kind of gotten kind of a dose of reality that's opposed to the title of this mistitled hearing. We all want what's best for kids, for children, and certainly children, folks, parents that make decisions, to put their children in harm's way to bring them here versus using a legal immigration system. And I'll be the first to tell you that our legal immigration system is broken. It needs to be fixed. Quite frankly, we need to make sure that the front door into this country works and works well. for people who want to come here and be citizens. But, you know, a lot of the concerns we have heard about today, it was kind of interesting to see some of the references within the testimony. Judge Metcalf, thank you for some of the references that you put in there, you know, showing how, you know, what has been blamed on the Trump administration very clearly through the documentation started that practice with cages, and that's what they look like. Whether that was the intent or not, it was under the Obama administration. Judge Metcalf, there's been a lot of concern expressed today about immigrant families not accepting services that they are eligible for out of fear of exposure. In your testimony, you discussed several immigration reform efforts you think would address the various problems in our current immigration policies. Judge, I know you're not an expert on all the programs in this committee's jurisdiction, but how would your proposals make it more likely that immigrant families would feel more comfortable claiming services that they are eligible for?
I missed the last part. Eligible or not eligible for?
That they would be eligible for.
Well, first of all, education. That's the first thing. First of all, you tell the kids at point of receipt of services, to tell the parents at point of receipt of services. The way we educate in Kentucky, and that's my only reference point, and with my experience in Miami, you know, public services do a pretty good job of telling people what they can get. And when you are educating around the receipt of public services, it clues everybody into what they can have and what they can't have in some cases. What I'd prefer to see is that we use education as a tool to assimilate everyone into our democracy. And even when it comes to those who are here illegally, treating them with the dignity required by the Immigration and Nationality Act assures them that we have a rule of law solution to these problems.
Yeah, I know this is a basic question to many involved in immigration policy, but since the underlying immigration issues raised by this hearing fall outside of our committee's jurisdiction, could you just provide us a brief overview of the various immigration statuses that immigrant children and their families would have?
Well, I think the way to look at it is this. When someone enters the U.S. illegally, and by that I mean come in across, violate a border, or let's say overstay a visa, you're not removing the children per se, you're removing the lead alien. The lead alien is usually the father or mother who brought these kids in. The kids, they're going to be treated just like kids any other place, and that's the way they should be treated. Their status is uncertain at that point, but they're alleged to be illegal. Now, what I prefer to do in all of those cases is, when I was a judge, is to say, what relief can this person seek? Is it asylum only, or might they qualify for a form of cancellation or adjustment? And in those cases, we gently nudged through the attorneys before the court to getting these people in the right form of relief so that they would have their best chance to succeed in front of the court. Now, as to the balance of your question, the only way I can answer it is by looking at the various statuses that are available. One is TPS. TPS has to be renewed. As long as you obey the laws, generally speaking, you don't commit 2 misdemeanors, in other words, Class A misdemeanors, you're going to be fine until it's determined that a whole class of individuals is supposed to leave. Those are the only things that I can think of that mirror a response to your question, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Metcalf, I appreciate very much the way you have described how you've handled cases in your court, and I think that should put to rest in the minds of a lot of people that we've got people in these courts who are treating people unfairly or unkindly, and I appreciate those comments that you've made. And it certainly shows that there our judges, and my guess is that you are representative of them, do show compassion to these immigrants, regardless of their status. As you said in your statement, we have the most welcoming and inclusive immigration laws on the planet. But could you also talk about the damage done to our country when we ignore our own laws and in some cases actively encourage people to ignore the laws?
Yes, ma'am. The whole point of our Immigration and Nationality Act, it has three goals. It is produced, or it was passed to do three things. One is to attract the talented and the hardworking. Two, it was meant to provide relief or redeem the persecuted. And three, it was intended to remove the offender. It serves those purposes very well when we enforce the law, when we make borders sovereign, when we give relief to those who merit relief, and we bring them into what I like to say is, into full communion with the rest of our society. And the way we do that is by following the laws that are on the books. The way we got here is we weren't following the laws on the books, and the way we get out of it is to start following the laws on the books. Now, what has been addressed, Madam Ranking Member, is a DACA solution. From talking to staff, I understand there is support for that. That's a great way to start, and bringing everyone together at the same table and putting DACA into effect, codifying it, in other words. I think that's a perfect way to begin to solve the problems that this hearing has identified. As far as making sure that people who are here illegally receive the full benefits of education and health care and meals, I think everyone in this room is all about that, ma'am. And I think that that's a down payment on being able to convince people that we are striving to do the right thing.
Many of my colleagues have pointed out, and I really want to associate myself especially with what Mr. Wright said and some others who talked about our language. Illegal is the appropriate term for us to be using, as I understand.
It is, ma'am.
And the language of the statute used the word alien, because someone who is not a citizen but is here is legally an alien. And so the term illegal alien, it has been used and has been used appropriately. You also talked in your testimony about the subject, and it's come up today, about the Trump and Obama administration's approaches to unaccompanied minors. Could you walk us back through that data, explaining how those numbers have changed, and describe to what extent the Obama and Trump administration approaches have been different?
Well, ma'am, I think that, first of all, you can see that and I refer to page 2 in my testimony, and I outline the fiscal years and the people who were then placed, the children who were placed in the UAC programs. We know that beginning in 2000, or the fiscal year 2013-14, we had a tremendous surge at the border. In that year, the Obama administration did exactly the right thing. It placed 53,000 children in the UAC program. This is the same year, in fact, where we have the picture that has been described as a cage. Those were actually chain link fences that were brought, or gates, brought together and created a vertical barrier. As far as I know, there were no horizontal barriers that were used to pin children in. And in fact, it's wise for us to remember that what was termed as cages were intended to keep children in a safe area and away from things that might harm them if they got out of control, for instance. That's been way too politicized. But when you look at what the Trump administration did with the next huge surge, which is FY 2018-2019, you have about 73,000 people, plus and we brought in $4.6 billion worth of aid to the border to address hygiene, food, health care for all of these people. I call that a win for Congress. I call that a win for the executive.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Barros-Gonzalez, as you're aware, the Flores decision requires children in immigration detention under the Office of Refugee Resettlement to receive an educational assessment upon arrival at the detention center. Why is that assessment important, particularly for those eligible for services under IDEA?
An educational assessment helps establish a baseline of understanding of the child's developmental competencies at that time. Given that many children are going through traumatic experiences, the assessment allows educators and practitioners to gauge where children are. My understanding is that the assessment needs to be done with someone who is creating a safe space for the child to be able to demonstrate their competencies in their language of origin, and that the child needs to feel safe and needs to have good sleep, be well nourished, and that allows for a baseline understanding of the child's competencies.
And if they're eligible for services under IDEA?
That I am not as versed in, but I am happy to do research and get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Falusi, we heard about the problems if children are discouraged from getting immunizations. What other problems occur if children are discouraged from accessing public services like health care and nutrition services?
Right, so thank you for the question. The things that I worry about are children not getting those basic screenings that I mentioned and going under the radar if they have developmental delays. For example, we screen for motor delays, speech delays, we screen for autism. So I imagine then children who may have some of these risk factors not getting diagnosed and possibly then not doing as well in school or in their communities, whereas we know we have really effective therapies to be able to address these issues once we discover them in our health centers.
So if you're doing the assessments and they're eligible for services under IDEA, it would be important that they be identified early so those services can be available early?
Absolutely. We know that early intervention is really the best way to address some of these delays and concerns.
Okay, and you mentioned toxic stress. What problems occur when people are subject to toxic stress?
So children are especially sensitive to toxic stress. The toxic stress response in children can manifest both physically, so with fatigue, trouble sleeping, the delays, as I mentioned, acting out behaviors, including actually aggression, but then I see actually a lot more of depression and anxiety and withdrawing behaviors. What we know is that then in the long term, as the stress response continues over time, is that it can have immeasurable and long-lasting effects on their bodies, including things that may be expected like post-traumatic stress disorder or continued depression and anxiety, but then also physical illnesses, diabetes and heart disease, and even increased risk of cancers. So these early childhood exposures certainly have, and research has shown over and over, long-lasting physical and emotional effects.
Is there anything you can do about it?
Certainly, we can ensure that children are not subjected to fear and anxiety. We can encourage families to utilize these services and benefits that they're eligible for, and that when they do, there is no stigma attached to it. And additionally, we can ensure that children stay with their parents or with trusted adults. What can buffer toxic stress is having an adult who's caring and who is responsible for that child to stay with them to buffer that stress. We all undergo stress, including children, but we don't see as many of those long-term effects if there is a parent there who has not been separated from them, but actually remains with them.
Thank you. And Mr. Martinez, how do you respond, how does the school system respond if a lot of children are showing up with a gap in education?
So unfortunately, that is the story of our lives in San Antonio. 60% of my kindergartners are at the lowest level nationally. And so for us, what we have done is just ensuring that first we have preschool programs, we have diagnostics so we can identify where children are at. We're trying to recruit the best teachers, and we've had a lot of success in bringing in those teachers because there's no magic bullet. It's having more resources, more teachers that can understand what the needs are, and of course, having solutions for the non-academic challenges, because whether we like it or not, those issues become very relevant if they're not addressed. And I agree that if they're addressed early, I've seen amazing things happen with children that have autism, children that have speech impediments. When it's caught early, it's amazing what can be done with those children as they get older.
Thank you. My time has expired. Recognize the ranking member for closing statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I turn to the substance of this hearing, I think it's important to note a few issues about this hearing. First, hearings should be about fact-finding. The title of this hearing presumes a conclusion rather than poses an issue to discuss and learn about it. Which leads to a second point. Mr. Chairman, you said at the beginning immigration policy is not in our committee's jurisdiction, and we should not discuss what each administration did or said. However, the hearing title and your opening statement are all about immigration policy. When it was decided to call a hearing on a topic that is clearly outside of our jurisdiction, no matter how much you try to couch it, you should not be surprised that members of this committee will talk about the underlying policy. And it should not be a surprise that our members will take offense to the argument that we should not enforce our laws. Finally, many members on the other side of the aisle made comments about amendments we offered to protect babies born alive in the higher education markup, saying that was outside of our jurisdiction and not appropriate for a discussion about the HEA. I disagreed with that notion, considering we were discussing funding that supports institutions, and we should do what we can to protect all life. I wish the majority could see the need to protect all children. Now this hearing showed us what we learned before. Children who face trauma need assistance in our schools and communities. We also know that it's incumbent upon parents to help prevent that trauma when they can. When the parents are the cause of that trauma, we need sufficient support in place to help those children. That is not in dispute, and it is something we should and have discussed in this committee. What we also learned is that we need immigration reform and enforcement if we're going to help these children, these families, and our communities. And that reform will come only if we put the politics aside and work in a bipartisan fashion. We know this is possible, Mr. Chairman, because you have demonstrated that in other situations. I sincerely hope we can consider the directive to discuss this issue has been met, and we can get back to working in a good bipartisan basis moving forward. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I remind colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission of the hearing must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing. Materials submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. Only a member on the committee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing record. Documents are limited to 50 pages each. Documents longer than 50 pages will be incorporated into the record by way of an internet link that you must provide to the committee clerk, but please recognize that years from now that link may no longer work. Finally, without objection, I'd like to enter into the record a report from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights that outlines how the administration's changes in immigration policy have created an unnecessary human and civil rights crisis at the southern border. A brief from the Society on Research and Child Development that explains how to treat deportation, explains how the threat of deportation negatively affects children's development. Paper from the UCLA civil rights project that examines how the current administration's immigration policy has contributed to educators' stress and mental health difficulties. Research from the Center for Law and Social Policy, explaining the chilling effect of the administration's immigration policies have on early childhood education program enrollment, and a joint Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Justice and Department of Education, published during the prior administration, detailing steps for schools to ensure their enrollment procedures are in compliance with Plyler v. Doe. In closing, I want to recognize recognize myself for the closing statement, thank our witnesses for being with us today. The hearing provided committee members the opportunity to examine facts surrounding immigration policies and how they are harming children within our borders. I want to highlight just a couple of things. That one, we have a moral and legal responsibility to protect rights of children, immigrant children, and guarantee all children access to education and nutrition programs they need to grow and learn. As I've said before, we're not responsible for the immigration policy, but we do have a responsibility to ensure that each child in this country can have a safe and healthy childhood. So I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. Look forward to working with all of my colleagues towards that shared goal. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days to receive any further comments. Is there any further business to come before the committee? If not, the committee is now adjourned.
Nice to meet you.